Landscapes take up a lot of space in Southern California. It's true that there might be maybe larger parking lots than we really need in some areas. And arguably, maybe there is too much asphalt from kind of an environmental sustainability perspective. But if you look at most of Southern California, as well as much of California in an aerial photo, there's actually quite a bit of green, or in less irrigated areas, quite a bit of soil. It's very different than like downtown Los Angeles or New York City. And for a long time, within those landscape areas, especially in the suburbs, especially in front yards, the question has mostly just been, does the front yard fit in? Or if it goes beyond that, what does the landscape look like? And the last series of droughts has really opened up an opportunity for a new and I think much more interesting question. It's not just about whether things fit in anymore. Fortunately, even in homeowners associations, you can't be required to have lawn anymore. There have to be other alternatives. There can be some restrictions to kind of meet minimum kind of aesthetic standards. But in most neighborhoods, there's a variety of different landscape types that are now totally acceptable. And so more interesting than just, is it a lawn? Does it fit in? Or what does it look like? Is, what does your landscape actually do? What does it do for you? What are you putting into it? And what are you getting out of it? And so landscapes should look great. Landscapes should be beautiful. I want to see beautiful landscapes, but that's really a minimum. And when we look at what our local landscapes can do for us, it gets much more interesting, and a wider world of potential really opens up. And so this is a picture of my front yard in Pomona, California in the spring. And this is an example of one of the things that my partner and I designed our landscape to do. In addition to being beautiful, we really wanted it to be a great habitat for local native songbirds, pollinators, and butterflies. And so this is from one of the windows inside my house, looking right out into a perch that we set up for a black phoebe, which spends a lot of time catching little insects in our front yard and is wonderful to be able to see right outside of our house. And our hedges and shrubs are still in the process of growing in because it's only a couple of years old. And so here's one of the big ideas from the workshop. California native and Waterwise landscapes do more. And if you are joining us from outside California, the native landscape from where you are does more as well. They are just much more dynamic places where there is a lot more going on in a good way. And they generally require far less labor to maintain. And so just to be fully upfront, if you are just putting a check in the mailbox once a month and somebody comes and does all the landscape maintenance for you, it's not necessarily going to be less labor for you. However, most California native and Waterwise landscapes, the plants themselves only really need to be touched or maintained once or twice a year for most plants. And that work happens mostly in the spring and mostly in the fall when it's pleasant to be outside. So if you look at total input for what you get out of it, these landscapes do a lot more for us. So starting with beauty as a minimum, here's a few pictures of some of my favorite California native plants that grow really well and are very easy to maintain in home gardens. In most of Southern California, these are plants that want a good deep watering just about once a week throughout the first year. And then it tapers off. And most of these landscapes, you're looking at watering them only every 3 to 4 weeks after that first year, year and a half, once they become established, and are just such beautiful plants with a more unique look and sense of place than anything generic. And when you're working with the native plants to where you are, you start to build not only beauty, but also habitat. And we're talking about habitat for the wildlife that's lovely to have around, for songbirds, for butterflies, for pollinators. In most cases, you don't need to worry. You're not going to plant a native garden in the suburbs and have a mountain lion show up. The habitat is not quite that powerful, but you will have all sorts of cool stuff around. And it's amazing, no matter where you are, no matter how urban of an area, birds and pollinators will normally find you within the first year, even when the plants are just starting to grow in. And so if you like a kind of wild look like this, that's great. And that actually kind of maximizes the habitat benefit. But if you work with the plants and still have a more formal approach, that is just fine too, and is still going to provide so much more environmental benefit than a typical conventional lawn type landscape. And so absolutely lovely. And then you might get graced with something like this, get to see a hummingbird nest and little hummingbirds grow up in your yard. All of this makes our landscapes much more enjoyable places to live and learn. They truly become places of lifelong learning. And so whether it's for you, your kids, your grandkids who come and visit, all of the above, these gardens become dynamic places where it's completely different than kind of a conventional turf landscape. With a turf and maybe some roses kind of landscape, the goal, kind of the ultimate expression of that landscape, is to do a whole bunch of work so it almost looks like a static picture. It's mowed to always look the same. It's fertilized to always look the same. It's heavily watered in the summer to always look the same. And it'll look the same as many days of the year as possible if you do a really good job. A native or locally adapted Waterwise landscape is the opposite, sort of in a good way. They are meant to change throughout the year and throughout the years. There can be always something coming into bloom if you're in Southern California or a lot of the Southwest. Here in Southern California, we have different native plants that will be in bloom every month of the year. And if one of your goals is to always have stuff in bloom, you can totally do that. There's always something coming in. There's always something fading. And with that, you then get a whole different cast of, for example, birds that might come to your garden. And so there's some songbirds that might live there year round. But for example, right at the beginning of fall, this year, it actually happened to be on the first day of fall, the white-crowned sparrows, which spend their summers up in the San Gabriel Mountains, showed up back in my yard, and they'll stay here all fall and winter, and eventually in the spring, they'll head back up to the mountains. And so it's these kind of different seasonalities, these things that really cue you into the world that's around you, that start to just happen right outside your door, like magic. To me, that's really exciting, and I would love to trade in the conventional landscape to have that any day. And so whenever I move somewhere, I plant a native garden and it shows up. And all of that really builds us into a sense of place. So instead of living sort of in a suburban lot, a lot of us, where you can sort of be anywhere in the country, you start to cue into really where you are. And I really like this quote from Lady Bird Johnson, former First Lady. She was one of the first kind of nationwide, covered in the media, proponents of people starting to work with native plants in their built landscapes. And she said, native plants give us a sense of where we are in this great land of ours. I want Texas to look like Texas and Vermont to look like Vermont. And I'm a little bit more cynical than Lady Bird Johnson, but my take is it costs a lot to live in California. And if I am lucky enough to have a little patch of land somewhere in California where I could decide what's going to go there, why would I want to do a bunch of work, spend a bunch of water, and still have a yard that's going to look in the middle of summer, kind of like a parched imitation of what's an East Coast, and really before that, a temperate European landscape style? I'd much rather wake up to the natural beauty of California every day and enjoy it every evening, including all the sights, great smells, and sounds of the songbirds that come with it. So what might that look like? Well, it can look like a variety of different things. So here is one example of a California native front yard that was designed and installed by the homeowner in Pasadena in the San Gabriel Valley. You will notice that some of these pictures are credited to the Theodore Payne Native Plant Garden Tour. The Theodore Payne Foundation is a nonprofit that's based in the San Fernando Valley in Sun Valley, and they exist essentially to promote the conservation of California native plants. And a large part of that is through encouraging people and helping people put native plants into the landscape. They have an amazing California native plant nursery that's open all year round, and they do lots of great programs, including every spring a 2-day around different parts of Southern California, mostly in the general Los Angeles area native plant garden tour, where if you sign up, you get a map and you can come and visit many, many gardens, take pictures, talk to the homeowners, in some cases, talk to landscapers or contractors that were involved in the process. And so this relatively small front yard in Pasadena, pretty close on a side street, but pretty close to a pretty busy main street, was totally transformed by putting in this front yard garden. Not only are there those habitat, not only is there more color and interest, but just from all the different heights of the different plants, the house also feels like it's much kind of farther back away from this relatively busy street, and just really creates a sense of calm and a sense of peace on the property. If you like a more formal kind of approach, you can still do that with Waterwise and native plants. Here is another San Fernando Valley, very similar to Inland Empire, both these kind of climate, soil types, and all that sort of stuff. So if you're local to the Waterwise Community Center, all this would work for you. This is a much more formal version. So this is probably about an 80% California native front yard landscape, and most of the other plants are kind of Waterwise Mediterranean plants. And it takes a lot more clipping, a lot more work to achieve this kind of look. The habitat value, because of all that clipping, is not quite as high, but still kind of night and day compared to a conventional landscape. And it absolutely can be done with Waterwise and native plants. So where do you start? One of the big ideas from this workshop is you don't start here. You don't start at a nursery grabbing plants, even if it's a really good local nursery. Because what happens for most of us is that when you go from taking out a section of your yard or renovating a section of your yard, whether it's a large planter or a whole front yard or a backyard, and you hit the nursery, what you end up doing is grabbing one of this and two of that and one of this and three of that, and you go buy something because it has a really beautiful flower in the little 1 gallon pot. And then you'll take it home and you'll look at the tag again and you'll see that actually it wants to be 12 feet wide and you don't really have a space for that. You might get plants that want part shade that you only have full sun, or often I've seen people who get too many beautiful plants that really want full sun, where maybe they don't have quite enough full sun in their yard for that. And so what you want to do is you want to not start at the nursery. Going to a great nursery comes later and can be a very valuable part of the process. But what you want to do is first start with your goals. Think about your goals for the project and then go from there. I'm going to take a brief pause to make a note. I realized that I jumped into this presentation without telling you how to ask me questions. So we have a really good group with us on the online workshop tonight. There's currently 63 people with us. And so if you want to ask questions, which I encourage, we don't do the raising hands because if then we call on people, there's a lot of downtime and technical problems with the audio. So the best way to ask me questions is to type them into the Q&A function. And so in your Zoom kind of interface window, you'll see a little area where there's a couple of text bubbles and it says Q&A. If you click on that, it'll launch a little window where you can just type in your question whenever it occurs to you. I have that open, and I see the ones coming in on the Q&A, and I'll stop kind of in between topics and then answer all the questions that have come in. Because we do have a large group of people, the questions that I answer as we go will be kind of limited to the ones that are related to the topics we've been talking about, where the answers are going to be relevant to a lot of people. If you have more personal questions that are more, how does this affect me? And kind of, here's my specific situation, what would you recommend? Then I am happy to try to answer as many of those as I can, but I will probably have to hold those till the end of the workshop. And I'm happy to stay a little bit after 8:30 at the end and answer as many of those as I can. And so that is the Q&A. Feel free to type any comments you have into the chat. I always read all of those at the end of the workshop, but it's really much easier for me to see the questions coming on and keep them organized if you type them into the Q&A area separately. Okay, so getting back to it, you want to start with your goals. Plants come much later. But if you start with your goals, you'll eventually make sure that you have a nice design and nice plant selections. And so here is a list of goals from one of the more challenging residential projects that I had the pleasure of working on. And the reason why it was challenging is because it was my parents' yard. So I've been doing landscape work for a while and used to working with people who wanted my ideas because they maybe respected my experience and opinions. And then the turf replacement rebates got really good in Southern California. So my dad, who was never interested in doing anything with the landscape, loves a good deal, and so gave me the call. And my dad's list of goals was actually pretty easy to work with. His goals were whatever makes your mom happy. But my mom had a big list of goals for actually a relatively small backyard space. So the goals were a comfortable place to sit and read, a place that feels relaxing, the sound of water to help dampen the noise from all of the lawnmowers and weed whackers and string trimmers that were still maintaining all the other lawns in this area. Something that would be relatively simple to maintain, something to hide the less than attractive cinder block wall that goes all the way around the backyard without spending a lot of money, something that would attract birds, look nice, a space in there to grow some vegetables, and cram all of that into a small yard while making the space feel bigger. And we can accomplish this through the process of design, which we'll talk about later, but it's not going to happen if we hit the nursery and buy a bunch of cool plants. We might get some cool plants, but we're not going to meet really all of our goals for how we want to use this space, how we want to trade in the lawn and get something a lot more functional and exciting for us. So we have the resources to help you with the plant selection part. We'll get to that later when it's appropriate. And so this is the backyard space, a typical 1950s built Southern California suburb in Van Nuys, California. For those of you local to the Waterwise Community Center service area, feels a lot like the 1950s areas of Ontario, something like that. So we had removed the lawn. We watered for a while. We made sure, for the most part, that nothing was growing back, dug things out that were growing back, and we're pretty confident that the turf was dead. So went through the whole design process. We'll talk about that later, but just to kind of show you the process and growing, here's April 2015. This is planting day. So laid out our plants kind of according to our plan, and then take a look at things. And you can always move things around. I always do, here or there. The plan is really just to help get you there as close as possible. And then you can always move things around. And our concept here was kind of mostly a meadowy area. So a lot of these are small plants, and this is actually a pretty high planting density. If you're dealing more with colorful shrubs, you're going to have far fewer plants than this, even though the landscape will grow in completely over time. And then working on just kind of laying out your site and picturing it. So I'm a big fan for pathway areas that are going to be open, kind of sketching things out just with an old bag of flour. Most kitchens or pantries have a bag of flour that's maybe a little bit older than you might want to still bake with it. So that's great to temporarily chalk things out. If it's going to be a while, you can hit in stakes or little flags. And then for laying out, for example, these perfect circles, I like to use whatever I have available, but essentially I just got a couple of wood stakes from the hardware store, used a mallet to pound one into the center, and then used just kind of a piece of strapping that I had, just kind of a strap to pull it out, kind of make a circle, go here. I think we started at 3 feet farther, make another circle, little areas to walk out, little area to sit, and going from there. So this is immediately after planting and mulching. We're going to put a water feature in here. So we have kind of like a buried area for the water to go, and just hadn't set up the water feature yet. And at this point in time, right after planting, this is where people doing it for the first time normally think, oh my God, the plants are tiny. It's just a few plants in a sea of mulch, and I should have bought way bigger plants and planted way more plants. I've known people who get to the stage and then they go out and they buy twice as many plants and they fill them all in. This is the time where if you went through the design process you're going to talk about, if you've done your research and then are thinking, oh, maybe I didn't really lay this out quite right, have faith. You've done your research, you've researched how big the plants are going to be, you're confident they're going to meet your goals, then know that they will grow in, and often pretty quickly. And so this is April 2015, and this is October of the same year. So not all the plants have grown in, but a lot of those plants are well on their way. And so this is just an example of how we use the process of design to accomplish those goals. So here is the sound of water. This is a pot that overflows down into this little vault and goes around with just a relatively inexpensive fountain pump connected to an extension cord. And then we have just a kind of a very simple Mediterranean and California native, but mostly in the backyard Mediterranean plants with a native grass-like sedge that provides kind of this unity of this space with lots of different accents throughout the year, a bench to sit and read, and using the different features to kind of create these separate spaces, even in this small yard. And so this water feature kind of separates the area with the bench to kind of sit and read as just like one person from the patio space that's built onto the house. A little bit farther towards the side, there's room for just one raised bed of vegetables, looking back towards an old lemon tree, which was one of the 2 trees there, which we were able to keep. And if you build it, they will come. So this wasn't even really focused specifically on providing habitat as one of the main goals, but even just having a clean source of recirculating water. And here is a falcon coming down to take a drink in the middle of suburban San Fernando Valley. Colorful accents throughout the year. So in this case, working with a variety of Mediterranean climate plants. So in the spring, we have the orange kangaroo paws from Australia and the orange red hot poker from South Africa. Similar climates. And that's kind of how we met those goals. Your list of goals might be very different. I'll show you an example from my current front yard later on. I had a very different list of goals, but the process of thinking through your goals will help you get to a design, which will then help you choose the plants later. We would have never thought, well, let's get so many of the same little sedge, that grass-like plant, if we just hit the nursery. But that really helped provide kind of a very low maintenance grounding where we could have all these other exciting accents throughout the year and have this small space have a lot going on while still hold together. So let's look at some other little bit of inspiration, because it really can look like lots of other things. So it can be an almost kind of minimal modern landscape. As you can see here, this happens to be the same sedge that we had in that yard, but just kept a little bit smaller. This one's probably cut back a couple of times a year with some other grasses and native trees. You can think about patio spaces. This is actually at the California Botanic Garden in Claremont, but it's kind of the size of a residential patio, really anchored by one beautiful Palo Verde tree. And you start to see all sorts of very usable spaces when the lawns go away as well. One of the things I'm really a fan of that you see a lot of in Waterwise and native gardens is these kind of looser, more natural, permeable patio spaces. And by permeable, what I mean is instead of a concrete patio where if it rains, that water is all going to need to wash off somewhere, it might cause a problem somewhere else in your yard, or you need to install a drain, which maybe will clog later on and can cause issues. Just for example, here, having a patio of pea gravel, most of that water is just going to infiltrate right into the ground, right in place, which provides environmental benefits and also happens to be much less expensive to install, much easier to change a little bit here and there over time if you need to. You start to see social spaces pop up, even in front yard landscapes. And I can't tell you how many people who've gone through this process in their front yard that tell me they met way more of their neighbors during and after they put in their garden than they had in all of the years that they have lived there. It becomes a point of conversation and a point of interest. Here is another picture of that kind of more formal, mostly California native front yard that I showed you earlier. And it can even be a modern style. I really like here how this very rectilinear use of these pavers creates a sense of somewhat formality, which then lets the landscape be very wild, but it all kind of holds together. Or it can be very naturalistic, like this decomposed granite pathway is what this material is called, lined by local kind of natural river rock and a mix of California native perennials and a meadowy area, all of which are still much, much lower maintenance than a traditional lawn. So we have this kind of California meadow sedge meadow, sometimes called Western meadow sedge, in our demonstration garden. And we literally water it about the same amount as like we would water a lavender plant, even in full sun, much, much less water than you would need to water a traditional lawn. And to me, for occasional use, also feels nicer to sit around or put out a picnic blanket in. It feels like you're kind of in a real natural space. So had a couple of questions come in. And then for those of you in Southern California, we will talk about the rebates that are currently available and some programs to help make it happen. For those of you who are not in Southern California, bear with us with that part. We'll get through that pretty quickly. Some of the information on how to meet the rebate requirements will be of interest to you probably as well. And then we will continue on. So questions that came up. From Helen, can compost be used in place of mulch? Technically, you can mulch. Technically, mulch is just anything put down on top of the soil surface. So oftentimes when people say mulch, they mean like a wood chip mulch. Depending on your planting, compost can be used, but for Waterwise plants, most of our Waterwise and native plants, they don't need or sometimes particularly want all the fertility in that compost unless you have really heavy clay soil where that compost can help kind of loosen things up a little bit. But even then, oftentimes people will put some wood chip mulch on top of the compost. Unless that's the case, the plants themselves don't need that extra fertility, where if you're talking about like vegetables or fruit trees, absolutely putting compost on the top can help. But for a Waterwise and native plants, they're adapted kind of generally to our leaner local soils. Okay, question from Scott Thomas. With our SoCal fire agencies getting more involved with review of local planting plans for fire-safe gardens and wildland urban interface areas, can you recommend sources for native plant pallets that are more fire safe? Good question. You might want to start with your local fire agencies. There's different fire agencies have different lists of plants. And sometimes even what one fire agency says is a plant that's like on the good list, another fire agency will say they don't really want to encourage that plant. So you can always start local. And then also I will mention that the Theodore Payne Foundation for Native Plants, who puts on that plant tour, just put out a new wildfire gardening related resource, and there's a downloadable PDF guide. It might have more general principles. I don't know if they have an actual plant list on it, but I remember thinking that it was a really great resource. So you can check out their website, which I think is theodorepayne.org, pretty sure. And you can look for that publication as well as anything kind of more local to your area. From Leanne, did I install irrigation at my parents' house or hand water? We converted the sprinkler to what's called an inline drip irrigation system, and we will talk about that later on. Okay, so with that, let's jump back into it and keep going. But if you have questions, keep those questions coming. So for those of us in Southern California, there are rebates available to help make it happen. Current rebates that are available. If you have lawn and are taking out an area of lawn to replace that lawn with a Waterwise garden or landscape, there is the turf replacement program, and that will give you a rebate per square foot of turf that you remove and replace with a landscape that meets the specific conditions of the program. We will talk about that later. So if your lawn is pretty brown because you haven't been watering it, if the thatch is still there, you can qualify. But if it's all the way down to dirt or weeds, or if you have shrubs and not lawn in that area, that will not qualify. It's a turf or a lawn replacement rebate program. You can also get rebates for weather-based irrigation controllers. This is a kind of new generation of irrigation controllers or timers that's the box often in your garage that tells your irrigation system when to turn on and when to turn off. Very mysterious for most people. However, I encourage you not to be afraid of them. One of the cool things about this newer generation of weather-based irrigation controllers is not only do they automatically respond to the weather, which for many types of plantings can help save a lot of water. But many of them, if they are within range of your home Wi-Fi system, or if you can extend the range of your Wi-Fi system to include the area where they are, instead of needing to try to figure out how to make changes to it, standing in your garage, kind of poking buttons on something that's more complicated than an old VCR, you can oftentimes have an app on your phone or a login interface on your computer by going to a website, making an account, and you can just do everything in an interface on a screen that's much larger, that's much more intuitive and easier to work with. And then finally, we will talk about it later, rotating sprinkler nozzles when we talk about irrigation. But if you are doing a large enough landscape where you're replacing 30 nozzles or more, which is only going to apply to those of you with pretty large landscapes, but do want to mention it, there are rebates to help offset the cost of this. None of these will normally cover the entire cost of making this change, but they can provide significant offset of the cost. With the exception being, if you are doing the turf replacement program and doing all of the work yourself and just buying materials, you can often have it cover the entire cost of doing the project yourself. But if you're hiring a contractor, it will offset the cost, but in the vast majority of cases, not cover the cost. For those of you who are more local to our service area and where we are, so if you get your water from Monte Vista Water District, Ontario, Chino Hills, Cucamonga Valley Water District, Fontana, or Upland, you qualify for a couple of other cool things. One of which is the free Smart Irrigation Controller Installation Program. That is a program where you can get one of those free smart irrigation timers or controllers that automatically adjust to the weather. One of the options is one of the ones that can connect to your Wi-Fi system, which is a great timer. It's the one that I chose to install at my home, and we have in the Waterwise Community Center gardens as well. And that with a class, which is now online, you can you take that class ahead of time, so it tells you a little bit about the machine and what it will do. They come out after you sign up and do a quick, what they call an audit of your irrigation system. Just turn things on, make sure that you don't have a bunch of leaks. So make sure that putting on this Waterwise device can actually help save water and won't just be having leaky water go all over the neighborhood. If there are issues, they'll tell you what they are and you can fix them and they'll come back. And with that, they will actually have a professional landscape contractor install that new controller for you completely free of charge. So that's an amazing program that I highly encourage people look into if you do get your water from one of these providers. And the way to start would be to get in touch with your local water provider by either going onto the website and looking in their conservation area. All the different water providers have them a little bit differently. Some of the water providers have an area where you can submit interest for the program right there. If you can't find that easily, you can always call customer service phone number and tell them that you're interested in the smart timer or smart irrigation controller program and ask to be put in touch with the water conservation coordinator, and they can get you set up. And so then back to the turf replacement rebate program. This is the rebate program that is the regional one. So whether you are local or from farther out in Southern California, essentially, if your water provider gets water through the Metropolitan Water District, then you can access this rebate program. Essentially, everything is at that first website I showed you for the turf replacement rebate, SoCalWatersmart.com. You can go to SoCalWatersmart.com and go to verify your eligibility and estimate your rebate, put in your address information, and confirm that you do qualify for the turf replacement rebate program. Some local water agencies, depending on where you are kicking in a little bit of extra money. So the way it works is that if you qualify for it, $2 per square foot is your minimum, and then it might go up from there. So for example, most of our local communities, the water provider is kicking in an extra $1 a square foot to bring it up to $3 a square foot. And so that would be what you get per square foot of replaced turf that meet the qualifications for up to 5,000 square feet per fiscal year. And their fiscal year is July through June. So if you have 10,000 square feet that you want to do, as long as funds are available, you can do part of it one year, part of it the next year, if that makes sense, kind of for the flow on your project. It looks like the funds will probably continue to be available. You can always go onto the SoCalWatersmart.com website, and they have a little kind of a little meter where you can see if the funds are close to being expired. And last I checked, they were nowhere near close. So that's good news if you're just starting to think about it. And here are what I find to be the most important things to share with you all before you get started. Kind of tips that we've developed because we answer lots of questions about it. Our agency doesn't have any formal role in the program, but we try to support people in our local area who are interested in the process and give them any information that they might need. And so, hugely important. Go to the website, read all of the details there. But most importantly, you cannot begin any work on your project until after you have received official approval for your rebate. So there's an application process. You give them lots of information. We'll go over some of the information that they're going to need. And then it's normally about a couple of weeks turnaround time, and they review your application, and then you get an actual like application number and the tentative approval for you to proceed. They actually do send out audits to check. I think it's about 10% of properties just to make sure everything is being done correctly. And so if you've already removed your turf, or if you don't actually have turf, then you will not be able to qualify for the rebate. So make sure that you don't do any work ahead of time. And here are some other tips that we have developed. So on the rebate application, there's going to be lots of information that's very obvious: contact information, address, all of that sort of stuff. You will also need to tell them your total lot size. So not just the area that you're working on, but the total square footage of your property. Some people don't have this at hand. The easiest way to find that is just type your address into any search engine, like go to Google, type your address in. The first number of things that come up for almost every address are realty websites. You might not have your house on the market, but they just are able to automatically generate profiles for every single property. And just depending on which one you click on. So this happened to be Zillow, and this is for our Waterwise Community Center address on San Bernardino Street in Montclair. You will find the lot size. This is a large commercial property, so it happens to be in acres, but for almost all residential properties, it's going to be in square feet, and that will give you the size that you need. You will already have to have decided which areas of your turf are going to be transformed. So how many square feet in the front and the back and the side, and the number of square feet for each. So the rebate will pay per square foot up to 5,000 square feet. This may or may not cover the entire cost of the project, depending on many different factors. Essentially, if you're doing it all yourself, it might. If you're hiring a contractor, what we find is it's normally locally is covering between a quarter and a third of the cost of bringing in a contractor to do the work. Again, lots of different variables that could be based on. And it's always best if you can measure those areas by hand to do so. However, if, for example, your lot is a weird shape, or if you are removing something that's not kind of a square and it's a kind of hard to measure area, you can try going to Google Maps. And one quick tip, which gives you a pretty accurate version of a square footage calculation, is if you go to Google Maps website and type in your address and zoom in the lower left-hand corner, there's a box you can click and it'll bring it to like a satellite aerial photo view. And then if you right click with your mouse, it'll give you additional options that you don't normally see on the website. And one is measure. And over the aerial photo of your property, you can just do a connect the dots measurement of a certain area. And when you finish that, it'll actually give you the square footage of the area. So again, if you can measure, it's best to measure by hand with a tape measure and do the math. But if that's not going to work for you, if it's too complicated because of the shape, you can use that. And the results are pretty good. One of the other things that you are going to need to do to meet the rebate requirements is you're going to need to have what's called a stormwater retention feature. And so in addition to putting in Waterwise plants that don't need a lot of water, you need to put in some sort of feature. Think like a dry stream bed, like you see on the right, some sort of feature that's going to capture and let the water soak into the ground in one of the landscape areas that you are converting. And the reason why is because this rebate is here for people to put in what are essentially exemplary landscapes. And so each individual landscape that gets this rebate is not actually going to save so much water in that individual landscape that it's going to be financially worth it for the water agencies to pay people to take out their turf. But what they're trying to do is to get really nice examples all throughout the community, which will start to show people how landscapes should be redone when they're getting redone, so that people see them and think, hey, maybe I want that for myself. And so part of that in this day and age, where when we are redoing our landscapes, is we want them to, instead of just draining water out to the street where it might be lost to the community, hold on to that landscape, give the soil and the plants a deeper soak than they might otherwise get. And in a good rain year, that also might add up to helping doing a little bit more to recharge the local groundwater table. And most of our communities are looking at using groundwater as more and more of a resource, as imported water becomes less and less available, and will probably continue to. So we will talk a little bit more about stormwater retention features, but essentially think something like a dry stream bed, could be a rain barrel or cisterns if you meet other specific requirements. Don't get too caught up on what the individual words or names are. As long as you have some sort of feature that does the work of capturing water and you choose the label that is closest to what you think it is, you will be fine. And then you'll also need to tell them the total number of plants you are planning on planting as part of the project. And at this phase, when you're thinking about applying, you might not know for sure, but basically you need to meet the minimum requirements, which is at least 3 plants per every 100 square feet that you are asking for the rebate for. That's pretty easy to meet. Most of the time when I design just what I think is going to grow into be a nice garden with a mixture of a few large plants, some medium plants, some small plants kind of near the edges and along the pathways, it ends up being over 3 plants per 100 square feet. So just make sure that your number is going to at least meet that minimum requirement. They're not going to come out and count every single plant. And if you're not spot on accurate, you won't lose your rebate. As long as you meet the requirements, you'll be fine. You'll also need to be ready to upload through the website a copy of your recent water bill, a copy of your landscape plan. And with that, don't be intimidated. They really just want to see that you've thought about it some. Doesn't need to be on graph paper, doesn't need to be scale. I've seen a lot of different landscape plans that have been approved through this program. Some of them look like a 7-year-old who is not a good artist for a 7-year-old drew them. Just the rough shape of your yard and kind of what you are planning to do where. Doesn't need to have the identification of every single plant. Could be, tree here, native shrubs here, some perennial plants there, and you should be fine. You can refine your design later on. As long as your final design and what you install meets the rebate requirements, you will be okay. Then you will submit all of that, officially submit, wait for your approval. Once you get your approval, you have 180 days to complete your project. When you complete your project, you're going to upload completed photos, and then you can request your rebate. And so to be clear, your rebate comes after you're done with the project. So you need to front all of the costs up front. And then after a processing time, after you request your rebate, when you finish your project, you will then get a check in the mail. Also know that due to federal tax law, on your federal income taxes, you will actually receive tax documentation at the end of the year if you get a rebate. All rebates over $600 will be taxed. So if you're doing your $3 a square foot for 5,000 square feet and you get your $15,000 check, that's awesome. That's a good deal. But just remember, you're going to be taxed as income for anything over $600. So it's very important not to be surprised by that. And so here we'll look at some quick examples. This was my front yard at the time that I was doing the turf replacement program. I hadn't been watering the front yard. I actually did water a little bit after applying to kind of flush up and see what's dead and what's just dormant. But this can work because the turf is still there. So this can be approved. They don't want you to use a bunch of water to make it green again. But if this had been removed and it was down to dirt or all weeds, it would not be approved. Let's talk a little bit about the stormwater retention requirement, holding rainfall in your landscape. And so whether or not you are actually applying for the rebate, this can be useful to you, because it's just a really good thing to think about if you're doing a landscape renovation. Why not think about including it? So when people look at the list of rainfall capture features that you can use to meet the requirements, rain barrels and cisterns, which are essentially like giant rain barrels, are technically options. However, to meet that requirement, you need to have rain gutters all around your house. But I will say beyond that, usually rain barrels for most of us are not the best solution, because if any of you have rain barrels, you'll know this. When it starts to rain, even on like a medium or small size house, a 55 gallon, 60 gallon, 70 gallon, which is a typical size for a standard rain barrel, barrel fills up like right away, almost instantly, and then just overflows for most of the rest of that storm event, usually. If you're really passionate about rain barrels, you can put a bunch of them in chained together, but most people find that rain barrels essentially are good for capturing some water, filling up a watering can, and watering some potted plants on a patio or a porch. 55 gallons of water is just not enough to do much with watering a whole in-the-ground landscape area. So for example, just to kind of put it in context, if you have a 1,000 square foot roof area, if it rains 1 inch, which is a typical, like a good rain event. We haven't had a 1 inch rain event yet this year, but typical decent, here it rained 1 inch last night. A 1 inch rain event will generate about 620 gallons of water off of 1,000 square feet of roof space. So that 55 gallon drum doesn't do that much in terms of capturing that water if the rest of it just overflows and runs off. Conversely, if you have 1,000 square feet of Waterwise landscape, you might only need to water that landscape once a month. But when you do finally water that landscape that one time a month, it's the same thing. Normally, for most Waterwise landscapes, when you do water them once a month, you provide about the amount of water that would be like it rained 1 inch over that landscape in the months it doesn't rain. So that single watering event for 1,000 square feet of Waterwise landscape is usually going to take about 620 gallons of water. Seems like a lot to us, but that's only because most of us don't really have much of a conception of how much water we actually use in our houses and especially out in our landscapes. That's still a reasonable amount. So the scale of what we are doing with capturing or using water in our landscapes, even our Waterwise landscapes, just doesn't really equate with what you can do with just 1 or 2 rain barrels. What you can do in most situations, as long as you're not on a steep slope, is you can do something even modestly, like a little dry stream bed, and you can capture hundreds, if not thousands of gallons of water by letting the soil kind of suck that in, making an area around your plants that's nice and moist, even in a small rain event, and helping recharge the local groundwater table. That's going to be less expensive, less maintenance, and more environmentally beneficial in most cases for most of us, specifically in Southern California, than we can accomplish with rain barrels. Another thing about rain barrels is that if you don't keep them perfectly kind of screened off and maintained, that's 50 gallons of mosquito habitat sitting right outside your door, which you might not want. For those of you who are a little bit farther out and are actually in places like Nevada, the true desert, and you get those summer thunder showers, those calculations are a little bit different because those rain barrels might fill and drain more often than here in Southern California, where once it stops raining for the year, it could be dry for 9 months, sometimes even more. So the new approach to rainwater in terms of best practices is to think about what happens to the water when it falls on your property. And what you're going to kind of do is threefold. You want to slow that water down, let it spread out some. And when it's slowed down and spreads out some, that lets it sink into the ground more efficiently. And where you're thinking about sinking that water into the ground, ideally, is at least 10 feet from the foundations of your building, the garage, You can't always get that far away, minimum 5 feet, but 10 feet is better. And so you might have a feature that brings water through a little bit, but if you have a final kind of depressed area in the landscape where you can really let that water soak in, ideally 10 feet away from building foundations. And so this is an example of what I did in the front yard of where I currently live in Pomona. Is the roof doesn't have any roof gutters, and the eaves are in this 1950s kind of generic house. For some reason, it was just a little bit of whimsy. They're curved, and so would require lots of surgery to the eaves of the house to kind of be able to get a board across that would then support rain gutters. And so what we did is we decided we're just going to let the water come off the roof as it does. But there was a problem here because there's a slight slope that goes down towards the house, and this whole area would flood every time it rained. And so what we did is we installed what's called a French drain. And so where the landscape's a little bit wider here, there's kind of just a little bit of a dry stream bed. And there's just a slight slope that we dug into the bottom. But where the landscape gets to be right here, there wasn't really room with how the slope came in and the walkway to have a naturalistic kind of dry stream bed. We didn't want someone walking to the door to be kind of like rolling an ankle directly into this gravel thing. And so we put in what's called a French drain, which is really just a trench. It's about a shovel's width wide and a shovel's width deep. We just carefully dug down, and probably like 9 inches down, we found where the irrigation line was. So we had to stop there. And so we dug that trench out and just filled it with this coarse gravel. It's 1.5 to 3 inch kind of clean gravel that we just got from a local soil yard, and filled that up. And so the spaces in between this large gravel, there's all those little air spaces in between each stone, is enough for water to travel through and to be held on some. And so when water comes down off the roof, instead of flooding this area now, it goes into this gravel-filled trench. In a small rain event, it's just going to infiltrate in place. But because the bottom of it just goes slightly in this direction, in a large rain event, water is going to come around. We dug out underneath the pathway and just put a little open pipe in there, and it goes around the side of the house. You can see here, and around the back. This takes the water that would also sit on the driveway before and lets the water go into this French drain system. And then eventually goes around into the backyard where we can have a much wider, formal, I guess, informal dry stream bed, which later had more plants put in, which grew around this. And so really it becomes integrated as part of the garden. But this takes all of the water that used to flood in the front yard, as well as all of the water that comes down the long driveway, and holds all of it on site, helps hydrate our garden, and helps recharge the local groundwater table. So you might not need to integrate all of those different factors in terms of what you might do to meet those requirements. We're pretty ambitious in how we garden at home because we're super into it. Oftentimes, I'll just design for someone just a dry stream bed or just a French drain. You don't need to capture all of the water that follows. You just need to do something to capture some of the water. Can't be a teeny tiny feature, can't just be like a little 2-foot wide hole, but something that's going to make a bit of a difference. They don't give you any specific engineering requirements, and that can be a little bit confusing for some people, but just make a solid attempt is really what they are looking for. And so a lot of that just happens logically, starting with observation. So you look at your yard. When it rains, where does the water come from? Is it mostly coming from your roof? Is it coming from your driveway? Is it coming from your neighbor's backyard that they kind of paved all the concrete, now it washes onto your landscape? I've lived in a place where that's the case. How much water is it? Is it just a little bit coming off of a roof gutter that you'll then kind of use to the best advantage? Or do you have current problems that you need to solve? Are there areas that flood? Are there drainage issues? And you can turn something that's a problem into something that's more of a resource. How does it already move through your property? Is it stopping in areas where it's causing problems and you're going to need to dig trenches or dig out an area to move that water? Or I've also worked with people where the water comes off of their roof gutters and it naturally flows into their backyard lawn. And then there's a low place in the lawn in the backyard where it naturally settles. In that case, when we were removing the lawn and putting in a garden, all we did is dug out that area a little bit more to accentuate it a little bit, and the work was done. lined it with some rock. So it didn't need to be a huge project. So where does that end up? And can you use that to your advantage rather than needing to do a bunch of work to put in a new place where the water ends up? All of these are going to be site specific. And it's just really looking at what happens when it rains is where it all starts. And I highly encourage you, if we ever do get some rain, put on a raincoat, wander around in your yard in the rain safely, and see what's going on with the water and get your ideas about what to do. So it's a good time at what should theoretically, hopefully be the beginning of a rainy season. Hopefully we'll get at least a couple of storms, enough to see what we might want to do in the landscape. So here is another example that I really like of a very functional rainwater harvesting system. This was also on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour, designed and installed by a really talented landscape contractor in the San Gabriel Valley called Scrub J Studios. And so here, coming down off of this rain gutter, you can see the slow spread sink. And so the first thing they're doing is, instead of letting the rainwater come into the soil where it's going to be coming down quickly out of the downspout and might be washing soil around and causing erosion, causing problems, it goes onto this little tilted piece of concrete that dissipates some of the velocity, kicks that water into this another French drain. Not quite enough room if you want any landscape to be there, to have a kind of more naturalistic dry stream bed. So this is a gravel, and then on the top, mixing in some different sizes of rock-filled trench. I really love the reuse of the terracotta roofing tiles on the side. It's very beautiful, and kind of putting in a little bit of a meander for visual aesthetics. And here too, dug underneath the existing walkway. As long as your existing walkways that are oftentimes concrete are in decent shape, as long as there's not any big fractures or cracks in them. Usually for something that's not going to have vehicles driving over it, you can carefully dig out underneath from each side and make an area where the water can go through underneath, goes around to the side, and then out around where there's a final infiltration area. And here, in a large storm event, should it need to overflow, then it's not going to be overflowing into the basement of this house. This is actually a rare Southern California house that did have a basement. And before this went in, they used to have flooding problems sometimes in the basement. And so with this, all of that water in a big storm event, even if it's too much for this to handle, then we'll just kind of trickle through this wildflower meadow of a native landscape, and then worst case scenario, go out to the street where water would be going anyways into the gutter, but there'll be less water and it will be cleaner for having moved through all the gravel, sand, and soil in the garden to get there. So more environmental benefit. And this aesthetic, very wild aesthetic, may or may not be what you would like for your garden, but the principles of the rainwater harvesting can be put into any style of garden. Often looks great and helps accentuate a natural style garden, but can be done formally as well. One quick tip, if you're going to be building your own dry stream bed or even working with a landscaper who doesn't do a ton of this work, is oftentimes what's going to look best is going to be working with the local gravels and rock native to your local area. So for most of us in Southern California, especially in Los Angeles area, that's kind of a river rock style, mostly granite. It's kind of all the different variations of gray and speckled grays and whites that we get. Really beautiful range. And there's a few reasons why I recommend that. One, environmentally, it travels less far and rock is heavy, so less environmental kind of harm will come from sourcing things. You're not sourcing exotic rock that has to be trucked in diesel trucks, all across the continent. Two, usually the local rock is less expensive. So our local gravel and rock here, this style sort of stuff from our local soil yards cost about a third as much as it would cost to do the same project with kind of more exotic gravels. And then finally, and from a design standpoint, extremely important is a lot of the sort of exotic gravels and stone are only available in sort of one size. And if you're just putting, a few pieces of gravel on top of a pot with an ornamental planting, that's fine. Get whatever looks nice to you. But once you scale it up to an actual feature in the landscape, if everything is only like 3/4 of an inch to an inch, it starts to look very artificial. One of the easiest ways to get that nice natural look is to work with different sizes of stone and gravel. So you can see here, this is probably a 3/4 inch to an inch natural river rock. And then there's cobblestone, some small boulders, there's smaller cobbles, larger cobbles. You can get different sizes of things and really have a nice natural look. Here's just another example of what would have been a long asphalt driveway, which would have brought water towards the garage. Most of the time when you have this sort of situation, there's a little dip here that's supposed to kick water to the side. But if there's a lawn that's been growing here for 30, 40, 50 years, oftentimes the level of the thatch has raised up and water gets trapped. And so here it kicks the water this way. And then in a small rain event, it'll get absorbed. In a large rain event, it can go out into this wider, young, just starting to grow in garden. So that's kind of the basics of rainwater harvesting. I do want to also mention that in coming up, I believe in January, possibly in December, you can check out on our Eventbrite page where you signed up for this workshop for the Waterwise Community Center when it is scheduled. But I will be teaching on a Saturday morning a full 3-hour rainwater harvesting for home landscapes workshop where we go way deeper into this topic and how to do it yourself, do kind of your site assessment, figure out what's going to work best for you. If you don't want to wait that long, you can also find a recording of the last time we taught that workshop on our YouTube page at cbwcd.org/YouTube. And so with that, we've talked about a lot of the basics. We've talked about setting your goals. We'll talk a little bit more about the design process in just a moment. We've talked about rainwater harvesting. And really thinking about your goals and things like where your rainwater harvesting, for example, your dry stream bed is going to be, are important before you get to start to choose plants. Because if you are just looking at a 1,000, 2,000 square foot space, maybe smaller, 500 square foot space, as a completely blank slate because you've torn out a lawn, it can be kind of intimidating for someone who's doing this for the first time to think, what are you going to put there out of all the hundreds or thousands of different plants you could buy? But if you've thought about what are your goals for how you want to use the space, maybe you're going to want a patio in this area. Maybe you know that you're going to want to put a shade tree on the west side of that patio so you can use it in the early evening in the summer and it's not full blasting sun. Maybe you know that you want to put a dry stream bed in this one area, and then next to that, you're going to have a couple of shrubs. The space starts to feel a little bit smaller as you pack all of your goals for that space into it. And then you can go to choosing plants, or you've decided that one of your big goals is habitat for local songbirds. Well, then that's also going to help you focus which plants you choose by doing some research into the plants that are going to be really great at providing those habitat resources. And so now we get to starting to choose plants based on our goals and what we might want to have going on the site. That's going to be a process of what should be fun research. Plants are cool, so get excited about it. Don't let it be too intimidating. What's going to happen for most people would be that once you start doing your research, you're going to fall in love with a bunch of plants. At this point, remind yourself, in most cases, it's best to kind of keep it simple for many reasons. A common mistake for first-time gardeners, first-time designers, is to put in way too many plants and crowd them. Another common mistake is to put in too many different kinds of plants rather than thinking carefully about your goals and selecting a nice but limited palette of plants that will meet those goals. So it's very common for people to start doing research, fall in love with a bunch of plants, and one of this and one of that and one of this and one of that, and they end up with 72 different plants in their front yard. And their goal isn't to be an amateur botanist. And what happens with that is it's very hard to get kind of a nice and cohesive look. And it's very hard, even if the individual plants are low maintenance, that's 72 plants you need to learn the identification of, 72 plants that you need to learn. Does this one get cut back in spring? Does this one get cut back in fall? Do you cut this one back hard? Do you just kind of lightly trim this one? Does this one you only cut back every 3 years? So for most cases, you're going to want to keep it simple. And if you just want a lovely garden, but you're not trying to be someone who your identity is, I'm a gardener, I'm an amateur botanist, for most cases, on an average sized front yard, we're talking about 10 to 20 different types of plants total. And that might be 1 or 2 small trees, That might be 5 to 10 different shrubs. That might be 3 to 10 different sorts of small perennial plants and ground covers. Can be just 5 different plants total. And if they're really well selected, could be a lovely landscape with big swaths of great selected plants. Relatively, you're going to want to keep it simple. And then the other most important thing to do as you start to think about plants for your garden is to put the right plant in the right place. That's sort of a mantra for gardeners, landscapers, landscape designers. Right plant in the right place, which means you want to match your plants to the conditions on the site, which is essentially, most importantly, your sun and shade, your drainage and soil type, and how big the plant is going to get. Those are the essentials. So for sun and shade, when you read about plants, you will read, does a plant want full sun, partial sun, or shade in most cases? Sometimes the words are slightly different, but that's essentially what those categories are. Full sun doesn't necessarily need to be full blasting sun up to sundown. Full sun is defined for purposes of plants as 6 or more hours of direct sunlight throughout the vast majority of the year. So in hot Southern California, we can still have full sun areas and work with full sun plants, even if it gets some afternoon shade, because by the time it gets to the afternoon in a lot of areas, it will have had that 6 or more hours of direct sunlight. Partial shade is either like a high dappled sunlight from a established tree, or can be sun for just a couple hours in the morning and then kind of shadier or progressively getting shadier afterwards, but doesn't get that 6 or more hours of direct sunlight. And then if something says it needs to be in the shade in hot inland areas, you better respect that. So there's lots of great, very low water plants in Southern California that need shade. And what that means is, if it's under a shade tree, then it's not going to need much water and we'll be happy. But if it even gets, direct hot sunlight for a couple of hours in the afternoon in the summer, the leaves can get burnt up and it can look pretty miserable for a good part of the year. So that's sun and shade. Drainage and soil type essentially is when your soil gets very wet, does that soil stay waterlogged for a long time, or does it drain out and just go down to being more, just kind of moist, but doesn't really stay waterlogged, after that? How fast does that process happen? Also related to soil type in most situations. So if you have a sandy soil type, when it rains a lot, or if it gets over irrigated, it's going to drain out pretty quickly. If you have a kind of a loamy, which is what lots of our like local valley bottom areas, for those of you who are close by, Chino, Ontario, all that good old farmland soil. It's a combination of all sorts of different soil types, and plants love to grow in that. That's also normally well-drained soil. But if you have a heavy clay soil, like for those of you locally, Chino Hills, heavy clay soil, that doesn't drain very well. And that's just fine. There are many Waterwise plants and many native plants that do want well-drained soils. And that's great if you have it. If you have heavy clay soil, or soil that for some reason acts like it's heavy clay, like sometimes a newer construction, if your house has been built in the last decade or so, sometimes even soils that are sandy are so compacted from all the heavy equipment that is used to build houses these days, then it might almost act like it's poorly draining clay soil. And so if you have poorly draining soil or clay soil, that's okay. There's lots of great native and Waterwise plants that can take clay soil, and I'm going to share a resource with you where you can easily see what many of those are. And so that in some ways almost makes your planting easier, because it's going to eliminate a lot of the plants that only want well-drained soil, but you're still going to have plenty of plants to choose from. For how to actually do a drainage test, which is essentially digging a hole, filling it with water, letting it drain out a couple of times just to make sure all the soil around it is wet, and then filling it with water a final time, and then timing how long it takes to drain out, and then basically calculating out how many inches per hour on average does that water drain out. That's how to do a drainage test. Doesn't cost anything as long as you have a shovel or can borrow one. But we don't have time to really go through the full example in this workshop, but you can get access to a full example of that if you take a look at our online workshop recording of choosing, purchasing, and planting Waterwise and California native plants. That's choosing, purchasing, and planting Waterwise and California native plants on our YouTube channel. For those of you who are taking notes and might want to skip ahead just to that, at about 12 minutes in that workshop, I walk you through and show pictures step by step of how to do a drainage test in your yard. And then finally, the last part is size. How big is that plant going to get? If that plant is going to get 6 feet wide, leave it a space for 6 feet. If that plant's going to get 12 feet wide, you better have a space that's going to allow it to be 12 feet wide, or don't put that plant in, or have a plan and actually want to do the work of pruning it to keep it smaller and find out that that plant is happy with being pruned. So for the vast majority of us, what we want to do is look up the full size that that plant's going to be and make sure we actually measure out in our landscape and give it that much room. I can't tell you how many times I see people put a plant that's going to want to be 6 feet wide, 8 feet wide, like a foot off the edge of a driveway. And that plant is not going to be long for this world. And normally before that plant is taken out for many years, it's just getting hacked back all the time and doesn't look good. Set yourself up for success. The plant is going to look better and be much lower maintenance if you have the proper spacing for it. Those three things, understanding those three things, is the vast majority of what it takes to be successful with plants. That and a bit of irrigation in Southern California, and kind of there you go. Most people who think they can't keep plants alive, I always ask them, do you research these main things related to a plant before you buy it and put it into the ground? Most people who think they're bad at maintaining plants and just they're bad at it, they don't do this research. They just put something in the ground randomly and hope for the best. Most people, even if they don't have any formal training with plants, who are just kind of good with plants, oftentimes they'll look up this information and buy the plant that's going to work for them. So we have some great resources for you, for those of you, especially in California or even in the Southwest, to help with plant choices. And what I'm going to show you briefly right now is the website that we developed here at the Waterwise Community Center, specifically to help you with that part. It's called the Inland Valley Garden Planner. And so this is the Inland Valley Garden Planner website. It's at inlandvalleygardenplanner.org. And we have a few things for you here. The main sections of the garden are the plant finder and the garden designs. So for those of you who are thinking this is still a little bit intimidating to select all your plants, that's fine. We hear that from a lot of people. That's why we created these 8 garden design templates to help get you going. So after working with people on design for a number of different years, we realized that what most people want kind of coalesces around one of these things or what they would be interested in. If that's not you, that's just fine. I will show you our other section where you can kind of create your own template from scratch all for yourself. But what a lot of people want in Southern California is one of these things. And so, for example, say you decide that one of your goals is to have butterflies and songbirds. You can start with the butterfly and songbird garden. And so what we've created with each of these templates is a kind of coherent list of plants, which can then be used together to achieve a lovely looking design. And so in each of these plant lists, you can see full plant list, we do try to keep it pretty simple. You can definitely add in other plants, and we encourage you to do so and customize it. But what we want to do is, for those of you who just want some great advice, we start with just 1 or 2 trees, a number of shrubs. All of these are compatible in terms of water, in terms of the look that you're going to get. They're generally all low water and pretty low maintenance, and then smaller perennial plants for like around edges, driveways, pathways, things like that, maybe an ornamental grass or 2, all of which are around a theme. So in this case, they're all great for butterflies and songbirds. This one happens to be all California native plants. And then for that, we kind of built out some design examples of what this would look like in a quite large, medium, down to a quite small front yard landscape. And then there's images of them. In the extra large landscapes, there's these patio areas in all of them. And so even if you don't have an extra large landscape, but say you're doing a backyard patio area, you might take a look at that. And so there's what it looks like. there is a labeled version, and we are working on the process of creating versions where you can just hover over them, see the plant ID, and then if you're interested, you can click see details. And for each one of these, it will launch a specific profile of all the information of that plant. And that's accessible for all the plants in this database. So I'll show you those profiles in just a moment. And then for each of those, there's also going to be the look at what it might look like kind of standing in or across the street. Some of them are from a slightly higher view, so you can kind of see deeper into the landscape. And for example, then if you took the trees away, so you can kind of see what's going on. And each of these are also matched up with a kind of architectural bird's eye view planting plan where you can see the plants, the sizes of the plants, and this is for every size. So say you have more of a medium-sized front yard. Here's how you might use those plants in the medium-sized front yard. And the visual rendering is an exact match to the kind of bird's eye view. And so you can see the spacing that we would recommend for how you might use these plants, which plants we put farther in, which plants we would put closer to the edge of the pathway potentially. And you could even go as far as, if you would want to download these and print them out. If you printed them on an 11 by 17 piece of paper, 1/8 of an inch would equal 1 foot in the real world. And so if you really want to get into studying these and kind of replicating them, you can, or you can just kind of do it visually. And so there's more here to explore, but we don't have too much time this evening. So that's kind of the basics. You can get that full plant list. And then for each of these here, you can click on that to view the plant profile. There's a description, how much kind of watering schedules that they're going to want after things are established, information about how to understand those watering schedules for your landscape. And then each of these different 8 themes, you can download a full PDF package of it if you want to download the file. So for example, here is for our woodland garden design theme, and you get this put together package where it has all of the files of all the different sizes of the yards. And additionally, at the end, and this information is also within the website, but it's easy to get to it and show all of you from the package. At the end, there's also some general design details available to you, really clearly spelled out. So, shoot, went back to the beginning for some reason. I'm sorry about that. So to learn more details about things like installing water harvesting features, getting drawings of how you would set up a dry stream bed on a little bit more of a technical level, but still really easy to install. And also then a color calendar for each of these themes where all of the plants, you can see what seasons they bloom in. So you can kind of plan out having things in bloom year round. All this and more is available for each of those templates. So that's if you want to go to the templates and kind of start from there, use those as ideas for how you might set up your own garden space. Or you might want to start from scratch, or maybe you just need a plant recommendation for 3 different plants to go in one planter that you're doing. The kind of heart of this website is the plant finder, where if you want to try to look up information about a plant by name, you can do that. But how a lot of people would use this is they would say, well, I know I want a shrub. Maybe I want it to be California native. It's going to be low water. This area is full sun. And maybe I want it to be attractive to butterflies. And hey, I do have poorly draining clay soil. So from there, instead of the 360 plants we have in our database, which is already our favorite plants from the many more that you can buy in Southern California, all of these are relatively easy to grow as well. Then you're down to 10 main plants that meet all of these criteria that we recommend. And then you can look at them. You can also see the size. They're all shrubs, but some are bigger, some are smaller. So think about right plant, right place. And then for all of them, you can then go from there and get individual plant profiles with lots of different pictures of what it looks like far away, close up, description. all these plant properties to find out the right plant for the right place, the water needs, so you can make sure to match plants with similar water needs with each other. And then you're also going to need to know how to maintain them, whether you're going to do the work yourself or you're going to hire a landscaper to do it. The reality is that most landscapers, there's a lot of landscapers out there in Southern California who work really hard, want to do a good job, but they just don't have the plant identification and training yet to know what to do with these specific plants. And so, for example, this plant, really easy to maintain, really tough. Mostly it's just cut back a little bit in the fall once a year. But it's really important. If you cut it back in the spring, you're going to cut off what would have just been everything that was flowering. So the landscaper or you would need to know, here's how hard you cut it back. Here's the time of year that you do it. And then in general, this plant, for example, only needs to be touched once a year. So for all of the plants on here, we have the maintenance recommendations as well. There's also other stuff to get into here. There's lists. You can create your own login where you can create a profile and you can save individual plant lists. So ideas for your front yard or your backyard, if you want to do that. Lots of other cool stuff as well. So that's the Inland Valley Garden Planner website. I encourage you to take a look and should really help you with kind of creating the plant palette for your yard. In addition, if you just want other recommendations to hear from me, what I think are some of the coolest plants for our local area and how you might want to use them, we have a workshop that I will be teaching within the next few months, but also you can look up a recording on our YouTube page called Favorite Plants for Inland Valley Gardens, where we go through my favorite plants by category. So full blasting sun, little plants for long pathways, plants that can be very happy in that funny little area on the north side of your house where it's shady a lot of the year, and then full blasting sun in summer when the sun is high up in the sky. Kind of one by one, go through favorite plants for all of those different kind of situations you're likely to have in your yard. And then for those of you who are in our local service area, which again are water customers of Chino Hills, Cucamonga Valley, Monte Vista, Ontario, Fontana, and Upland, you can actually qualify for our landscape design assistance program. There are a few things you need to do to qualify for that, but the main one is you need to attend this workshop. So you're already there. And with that, you can sit down with our staff and we will work with you and we will create a design for you for either a front yard or a backyard. If you finish and actually install one project and you want to move on to the other yard, we're happy to work with you for the next one. It's a no-cost program. We just require a $100 refundable deposit, kind of just a placeholder to make sure that you're serious about actually putting in the landscape. We fully hope that you will put in that landscape. And after getting your final design documents, if you put in a landscape, Waterwise landscape, kind of along the same themes, doesn't need to be exactly the same, within a year of getting your design documents, we are thrilled to give you a $100 refunded check. So basically what you do in most cases is you take a look at these 8 design styles we have on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, you choose a theme to start with, and then we customize it always for your yard. If for some reason none of these styles appeal to you, we can work with you to create something that will work. We'll work with you, we'll guide you through sending measurements of your yard, we'll set up a full kind of design plan ahead of time. You'll send us photos of your site because we don't visit your site. We do it all remotely. And then we have an online screen sharing meeting over Zoom, but it's one-on-one. And we have a meeting, we sit down, we talk about your goals that you've thought out, what you want out of your yard, ask you some other questions. And then we actually sit down and start to build your design together and wrap that up. We do more design kind of after that meeting's done. And then you get a full design and a planting plan, which you can then use to apply to the turf replacement rebate program if you would like. So full details for that are at cbwcd.org/design assistance. That's cbwcd.org/design assistance. You can also find it from our main website, cbwcd.org. And so here is just an example of a California native simple front yard with a dry stream bed and a decomposed granite seating area that we designed for a participant, which is now in the ground and starting to grow in and be a lovely space. And so what we are going to do from here is we are going to talk a little bit about construction and costs. Then we're going to go through a kind of quick example of how you would pull this all together in a landscape design. And then we will finish with talking about first steps and then connecting you with other resources about what to think about for turf replacement, or actually, sorry, turf removal, killing your lawn, as well as irrigation. So, had a question just come in about, is this workshop being recorded so you can review it again? Yes, it is being recorded. It will be posted on our YouTube page at cbwcd.org/YouTube. And if you scroll to the top of the chat, it's going to be right there at the beginning. I typed it in, so you can definitely make sure you get the spelling right. Okay. So, construction planning doesn't need to be rocket science, but just make sure that you consider it. I will sometimes work with people who get really excited. They've bought hundreds of dollars worth of plants and they've realized that they are months and months away from being able to put them in the ground. Not something you want to do. So think about your construction. Are you going to build out your design all at once in phases, or a bit at a time when you find the time, over maybe a couple of years? That's sometimes how I do projects, because it's just me on weekends when I have the time. If you can, plan to plant in the best season. In Southern California, mid to late fall, so basically think right now through New Year's, is actually the very best time to plant. Plants will go into the ground when it's nice and relatively cool. They might just start growing right away. Some will. Some might not grow that much on the top, but they will be rooting in, starting to get gently established. And that makes a huge difference. So when the heat of spring comes around, especially if we have a year where we get an early heat wave, those plants are going to want to grow on the top above the soil, but they will have a root system that will have a much better job at supporting those plants with the moisture that they need when it gets hot, and be less likely to get drought stressed or even die of drought stress. If you can, I recommend finishing big planting projects. Ideally, in December is perfect, but definitely by March. The problem with planting, even in April, and I've done it when I need to, but April is not that many months away from June. And in June, we can easily get triple-digit temperatures. And even though these plants are going to be water-wise and heat adapted after they're established, you need to remember that even water-wise plants have been growing in nursery situations, in rich potting soil, oftentimes in a little bit of shade, getting watered all the time. And so the mid to late fall, kind of into early winter, is the best time to transition those plants during the gentle time of year to get them ready for the heat of the next summer. So if you have a lawn right now, if you're just starting to think about it, this might not be something to rush. It might be kind of more of a schedule to think this through. Killing turf is actually best done in the summer. And so might be thinking it through, working on your design, killing your turf in mid to late summer next year, and planting this time next year, really being ready to do everything in the right time of year. If you're just starting to think about it. If you're already down to dirt, no turf, ready to go, now is a great time to get ready to go. Summer is a good time for contemplating design, killing your turf, which we'll talk about soon, preparing irrigation, getting ready. Think about your budget, whether you're doing it yourself, especially if you're bringing in with a contractor. Work with a budget and adjust your design, or maybe break things up into phases as necessary. If you're doing it as a DIY project yourself and you don't have much budget, that's fine. You can do it, a few plants this year, a few plants next year. I know plenty of people who have done projects that way. That can work, and you can still have a very lovely garden if you can't buy it all at once. If you're working with a contractor, definitely bring contractors in early, tell them what you are thinking about, and talk about costs up front so you know if it's going to work within your budget. So here's what we have been seeing lately in our local area for turf removal and landscape installation costs. There's many factors that can change this, but generally, to give you some sort of guideline, for DIY projects, if we're talking removing the turf, planting, irrigation, mulching, doing it all yourself, you can often do it within that $3 per square foot for our local rebate budget. If you're hiring a contractor, removing plants, removing turf, getting new plants, adapting existing irrigation and mulch with a modest water capture feature. Normally, we are seeing like $9 these days, even a little bit plus per square foot. Occasionally, we'll talk to someone who says that they actually had a contractor who did it more in the $3 range, but that's super, super rare. I would not assume that. I was just working with someone who just got a quote that they're going to start doing that was like $7 a square foot. So kind of think there. Think about maybe if you're not doing anything fancy, that if you're getting that $3 per square foot rebate, about a third of the cost. If you're doing all of the above, plus maybe you're demolishing like an old concrete pathway, putting in a flagstone pathway, doing some rocks, so small boulders, nothing huge, still working with small plants, maybe a little bit of landscape lighting, we're seeing those sorts of projects like $12, $13 a square foot would be a pretty common cost. But remember, this can depend on many factors. Your cost will not necessarily match these. And that's why it's really important to get multiple quotes. Think about it just like you were hiring someone to redo all your electricity, redo all your plumbing. The best thing to do with any contractor, including landscape contractors, is to try to get at least 3 people to give you quotes on the project. For those quotes, ask for them to give you the quote in as much detail as possible. Tell them you're getting multiple quotes. You want to be able to compare them. So it's not just, yes, I'll do your job for this much money. Have them break it down and then compare them. The lowest cost is not always the best. Sometimes you'll get one cost that's way, way low. Sometimes that's the person without really the experience to do the job correctly or to estimate the job correctly. So if it seems really low, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad quote, but for all of those contractors, if you're thinking about working with a contractor seriously, ask for multiple references and ideally ask for references of similar sized projects. So if you're having someone redo your whole backyard, you don't want a reference where they've done landscape maintenance only for them, or you don't want a reference where they've only done like one planting bed. You want references where they've done the whole front yard or backyard for the person. Call those people and find out, are they happy with the project? Was the crew professional? Did they clean up after themselves? Did they do it on the timeline they said they would? Make sure you're going to work with the right person. There's a lot of really great landscape contractors out there. There's also a lot of people who are someone who will give you a low quote and they have a truck. And we have had horror stories of people calling us saying, I haven't heard from my person in 3 weeks. And what do I do? So also realize California contractor law applies to landscapes. Technically, you should be hiring a licensed landscape contractor for any job where materials and labor add up to more than 500 square feet. Technically, it is illegal for somebody who is not a landscape contractor to offer to work on any landscape job that is over $500 total cost as well. But there are lots of people who skirt around that. If you hire a licensed landscape contractor, ask for their contractor number. You can look up online to make sure it's in good standing. And that will also protect you because contractors are required to carry all the insurance. So if somebody gets hurt on the job, their insurance will pay for it. If you're just hiring some guys and they get hurt on your property and there is no insurance for that company, you could be brought to court as well. So you definitely want to avoid that. And so that's basically the short kind of rant on working with contractors and trying to set you up for success with that. So with that, let's kind of, as a way to process all of this intense information, look at bringing it together in a design example. And we'll do that by looking at what I did with my front yard, where I currently live in Pomona, Southern California. This is the aerial photo of it when we moved in. Not much going on right there, just kind of a mostly dead lawn. And so if you are up for taking measurements and drawing things out on graph paper, it's going to be easier to do your exact design and get plant counts. If you are not up for that and you're willing to just kind of more work intuitive, you still should kind of draw things out. But if you don't do it exactly to scale, it might be hard to get your exact plant counts. But some people are just not going to do the thing, drawing it out on graph paper and drawing it to scale. However, I highly recommend it if you potentially are up for it. And so here's what I do. This is just the picture that I got from Google Maps. Actually, if you download a free program called Google Earth, and you could just go to search engine and go to download Google Earth. It's a program. It's actually called Google Earth Pro. It's a free program, and that lets you zoom in even farther and lets you save an image and print it out at kind of a closer and higher resolution. Something like this. I will print that out, and then I go out into my landscape with the tape measure. Easier to measure with two people. One person can hold each side of the tape measure, and I get all of my basic measurements. And even on Google Earth, for example, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll end up hand sketching on top of the computer print all the kind of rough shapes near the base of the house, because there's a little bit of an angle to it. You can't really see underneath the eaves. And then I take all of my measurements. Then I will take that and I will go to an 11 by 17 sheet of graph paper. Usually an 11 by 17 sheet of graph paper comes with 1/4 inch squares. And for smaller yards, normally you're going to set it up where 1 square equals 1 foot in the real world. And larger yards, you're not going to be able to fit the whole thing. So you might set it up where 1 square equals 2 feet in the real world. And then I take all of my measurements and then I kind of draw it out. Most people have pretty rectangular shaped yards, and that's very easy to do on the graph paper. If you don't, if yours is like mine and you have these weird angles, there is some work to do that. You can approximate it by counting squares the best you can, but I do have a series of videos that I will be publishing within the next few weeks onto that Inland Valley Garden Planner website, where I really walk you through and you can see me do this step by step to learn how to set it up. So I create that scaled base plan. I list my goals, have them nearby. So in this case, the goals for our front yard were beauty, habitat for birds, butterflies, pollinators. We wanted it to be low water use. We're on a cul-de-sac, and with a relatively small front yard, it's about 1,200 square feet. So not tiny, but not huge, and very narrow in the front. It kind of feels like on the cul-de-sac that there's lots and lots of houses that are facing each other, and there's no sense of privacy. So we wanted to get a little bit of a sense of privacy, a little bit of a sense of shelter to the front yard, but without just like putting up a fence and totally turning our back on the neighbors. We wanted it to feel like California, have all those beautiful scents, have blooms throughout the year. And also, because we are in a neighborhood with unfortunately not a lot of street trees, so it's very hot in the summer, but this front yard does happen to face north. So we have great views of the San Gabriel Mountains. And so we wanted to introduce some shade and some privacy, but we wanted to very carefully make sure that out of some of our windows, we maintain those great mountain views. And so again, these are all things that if we think about our goals and through the process, if we draw out our plan, we can definitely balance all of these things. But if we just hit the nursery and got cool plants, we wouldn't be probably just randomly accomplishing all of these goals. So we're going to go through the design process. And so from there, you go into your site assessment. And that's just a fancy way of saying getting down all of those important observations, most of which we've talked about already. What areas are full sun, part shade, shady, our soil and drainage. And basically for our drainage test, if you kind of do the dig the hole, fill it with water a few times, that third time, time it. If it tends to drain out 2 inches or more per hour, you have well-drained soil. 1 inch or less per hour, slowly draining soil. In between, kind of meh draining soil. Again, check out that selecting plants full workshop, and we talk much more about the implications of all of those in a way that we just don't have time to do this evening. You're going to think about your views, both your views off of your property, like our mountain view that you might want to keep, and your views onto your property, like if your neighbor's second story addition looks directly down to your hot tub, maybe you want a tree there. Water flows, just like we talked about earlier. Microclimates are one that we haven't talked about yet. Those are any particularly hot or particularly cold areas. So for example, full sun, inland Southern California, maybe right along my asphalt driveway, that's going to be a particularly hot microclimate where it's going to be even hotter there, especially on the summer afternoons, than it would be, maybe 20 feet away in the center of the landscape. The plants there really are going to need to be ones that can take that heat. Check out that favorite plants for Inland Valley Gardens if you want discussion of things like what are some of those plants that take those hot reflected heat microclimates. Thinking about noise and other neighbor issues, sometimes you're limited about what you can do with that. But if you have some kind of just general noise from the neighbors, I find a recirculating water feature, a little bit of that sound of that water, to be very soothing. And existing plants that you might want to keep. Doesn't necessarily need to be blank slate, but if you have a beautiful magnolia tree in your front yard, that's a medium water use tree, but there might be value to that. So maybe around that tree, you're going to keep it a medium water use landscape, and then maybe you'll work with drip irrigation. So farther away from that tree, you can go to more of a full low water landscape. And so essentially what I do is after I have this base plan, I immediately scan it, photocopy it, both. You only want to have to draw out this base plan once because it takes a while, but then it's very useful. And so then on a photocopy of that base plan, I take all of these considerations and I just draw out. I like to do it first in normal pencil, but then I'll use some color pencils once I have the basic shapes down to kind of keep the different categories differently. Just all of the things that I'm going to want to remember. What are the implications of that site assessment? So here I wrote mountain view. It's out of the picture here, but I want to remember that that's a factor to consider as I'm starting to get excited about plants. Here's that hot microclimate along our asphalt driveway. Here's the area that really feels too open because of all the small front yards on the cul-de-sac facing each other. In poking around in my landscape, I realized that we have a very shallow water main. The water main was redone. It's only buried about 6 inches deep, which is not great. And so if I'm thinking about water harvesting, digging a dry stream bed, just in my case, that ended up being a factor. Oftentimes it's not as much of a factor. We faced north. So we're full sun because it was just a lawn in most areas. There's no trees here. But on the north side of the house, there's this zone where through a lot of the year, the sun isn't fully high in the sky, especially this time of year. And so this is in shade pretty much all day. But then in the middle of summer, the sun is high. And then on the north side of the building, it's pretty much full sun all throughout the day. So the seasonal shade area, easiest thing to do for knowing what to plant in those areas is you want plants that can take either full sun or part to full shade. That's going to be not a ton of different plants, but in any climate that you're in, there are some great plants that can take that situation. And so it's finding and working with those. For those of you in Southern California, in that favorite plants for Inland Valley Gardens, I have a whole section on that. And so you can just look at that for some great ideas about what to do with those plants. And then here was that flooding area that I talked about early on. There was the area that we had to deal with. And what I like to do, just as a reminder for thinking through the water harvesting part, is to draw some little blue arrows that just show where water is coming down off the roof. So for example, if I did have rain gutters, this would all collect and maybe I just have a rain gutter in one area and all the water would concentrate there. But here it comes down everywhere. And so not rocket science. Those were going to be the main factors that were going to really have an impact on my design. Now, the cool part about doing all of this and getting this down visually is then when you start to think about your design, you can also get an 11 by 17 pad of tracing paper. And so as I'm starting to think through my design, I could be doing tracing paper right on top of my base plan, right on top of my site assessment. And so I can make sure that my landscape meets all of those needs without needing to try to balance all of that and remember it in my head. And then eventually you can slip the site assessment back out and just have the tracing paper over your original base plan. And then you don't have to see all of that. So really working with different layers of tracing paper. Another cool thing about tracing paper when you get into your design is that you can have like sections that you like and sections that you don't like. And then if you want to try another version of it to make it something you like more, you don't have to draw it all from scratch again. Put tracing paper back on top, retrace the parts that you like, start on parts that you don't like and work on a different iteration of it. And so normally just sitting down and drawing out a design, the first thing, that's not going to be the best thing. So depending on how much time you have, you might want to do 2, 3, 4 different versions. Think about what you like and what you don't like, even if you're working with the same site assessment and the same goals for your yard. And so here, just kind of starting to feel things out. So I don't jump right away into this plant here, that plant there. So here I was looking at, well, if I put a huge tree, like one of the first things we thought about is, should we just put a huge oak tree right in the middle? And that's a big native oak tree is what this landscape is going to be about one day. And that's very appealing, but that would totally block our mountain view. And that would be our whole front yard. And we had more room in our backyard to put or to have an oak tree. And we have an oak tree in the backyard. So here we decided to put a couple of small trees that we'd still, from most of our windows, except for this one, would be able to see out above them to see the mountains. But here we really wanted privacy because this is the area where we eat dinner. This is also the area where we hang out on the couch. And really all we see from here is the driveway and the neighbor's driveway. And we wanted to see more green. So by putting a small evergreen tree here, we can meet that, even though it would eventually block some of our mountain view. And then here we put a small multi-trunk deciduous tree is what we decided we would do. So it can be more closed during part of the year, more open during part of the year. And then on this side, we really wanted to block the view because all we see from this window, even though we do see out into the garden some, but especially visually, very dominant is the neighbor just has a gravel strip and then the driveway where there's cars parked. And that feels like, your eye would go that way instead of going down. And so here we put in what would grow into be a hedge was our concept. And that would be something that would get, maybe 6, 7, 8 feet tall, but wouldn't block our mountain view. And we do just a little clipping on the backside to keep it off of the neighbor's gravel strip. And so wouldn't be formal, wouldn't have to clip it all the time, but a couple of different native plants to provide great habitat for songbirds and to be that visual block. And then we can start to work with layers. And so one thing also to think about, quick design tip, is think about what the most important view is going to be. And so for here, there was a number of views that we were thinking about. We're thinking about people walking by on the sidewalk. We're thinking about people, mostly us, driving up the driveway at the end of the day. But we realized that the most often frame that we would view this landscape of was from our house, was either looking out the windows if we were in these rooms, or would be, like leaving in the morning, going to work would be one really nice view to kind of take in something that we want to have a little beautiful slice of garden. Whereas for us, our social space is mostly in the backyard. Our backyard's much larger than our front yard. So we might make some different decisions if we didn't have much of a backyard and we, our seating space or our patio area needed to be in the front. But for us, the view is mostly from here looking out. And so what we decided to do then is a way, especially in a medium or small landscape, to build some depth and kind of the appearance of having a larger landscape than maybe you actually do, is to work carefully with layering. So from whatever your primary view direction is from us inside the house mostly, or standing on the doorstep, you have your taller plants in the back, and then you have a medium layer of plants here, maybe some shrubs, some ornamental grasses, and then you have your smaller plants in the front, and you get that lovely layering effect instead of what sometimes people who just hit the nursery and get cool plants and don't think as much about the design part do, is it's just a shrub here, shrub here, shrub here, shrub here, shrub here. And everything is kind of a very similar size in the landscape. And you don't get as dynamic or as a kind of normally not as lovely looking as a space as if you think a lot about those views and how to frame that. And you don't need to be a professional designer. It's all very kind of logical. And so here, continuing to work things out. And so you can see just a rough sketch of what I showed you earlier, the little bit of dry stream bed that goes to the French drain that brings the flooded water around the house. And then once you start to work with that and you're kind of thinking about your concept, then you might start to put in ideas for individual plants. Also starting to think about like walkway space, like here, even in a 1,200 square foot landscape, most of the time people are going to want a pathway, even if it's informal, just a gap in the planting to walk in. So we were thinking, well, leaving from the front doorstep, we can maybe have an area that has a nice curve that goes in. We knew that we wanted it to be good habitat for birds, so we put in a space for a bird bath, but thinking through, again, the views. So we realized if we put a bird bath here, both us, but especially our cats who really like to hang out in both of these rooms can see what's going on at the bird bath from either of those rooms. And then starting to think here about, what plants we might want in this hedge, and then slowly building things in. And again, doesn't need to be your first idea. And so here, this design example takes a lot of inspiration from the bird and butterfly template, as well as some inspiration from the woodland template. And what I like to do is work with this tool. It's called a circle template. You can get it at an art supply store, or you can order them online relatively inexpensively. Same thing with all the graph papers and stuff. A good art supply store will have the 11x17 graph paper, easy to order online, as well as the tracing paper. And so these circle templates have circles at all sorts of different measurements. And what I do is, you can see my little Sharpie markers here ahead of time, is I will then mark the individual circles, what's called to scale, with the scale of my drawing. So in this drawing, as a small yard, like I mentioned, every 1/4 of an inch equals 1 foot. And so that means that if I have a 1/4 inch circle, so I find the little mark on the circle template, it says in this small text 1/4 inch circle, I make a little dot here, that's going to be a 1 foot plant. If it's a 1/2 inch, that's going to be a 2 foot plant. So I find that 1/2 inch and do it there. I do that for 3 foot. A 1 inch plant is 4 feet, all the way on up for all my common sizes, 5 foot plants, 6 foot plants. And that way, when I start to create my plant list using the Inland Valley Garden Planner, and I see how wide the plants are going to be, pull plants from those templates, I can think, well, maybe I'm going to want some deer grass here. It's a common native grass, great in landscapes. Okay, so that I'm going to do a 4 foot circle, because that's roughly the width of it. And then I can just quickly draw some circles in pencil. And then you're going to be doing erasing, so have a good eraser. And then eventually you'll work with other layers. But that's how you can start to play with your design and start to get from the concept, from your goals, to individual designs. And eventually you might work it out to something like this. And it's a tool. It doesn't need to be a work of art. And at this point in time, it shouldn't be a work of art. This is a rough tool to get you there to meet all of your goals. In addition to the plants in the bird bath, you can see drew in little boulders here and there, some little logs that we had from some tree trimming that had to happen, which are great to add to habitat, our pathway area. And, this is not, again, your first one is probably not the one you want to do, but kind of just work it out over a number of days or weeks, months, different iterations. And then when you have something that you really like, you can just use this as your planting guide. Or if you want to, sometimes it's easier for me to kind of look at it, to clean it up some. And again, doesn't need to be a fancy architectural rendering, but what I'll do is I'll take that one, I'll go back over with my circle template, and I'll kind of do cleaner lines, something that I'm not erasing a bunch on. And then with a pack of colored pencils, and there's a lot of them, but this was just a cheap pack that I bought online. You can color code them if you want. I also will normally do a final, like the initials of the plants, and just kind of as I go, draw out a little key. So I'll do one, I'll decide like this one in the hedge was California coffee berry. And I'll decide, okay, well, if I'm doing it in this green and it's going to be CC for California coffee berry, then I'll do it off to the side, keep everything organized. And to me, this took, I don't know, that'll take you an hour to do. It's just easier to look at than this. But again, whatever you want to do doesn't need to be a work of art. It's just a tool to then help you buy the right number of plants of the right species that are going to meet your goals, and then help you lay it out on the site. And so this is going to be the end of us talking about design. We're going to need to spend the rest of the class quickly going through turf removal and a little bit about irrigation. And so we have lots more design info for you. We have a couple of classes on our YouTube site, all specifically 3-hour classes about different aspects of design. And then finally, these images that you saw were screenshots from a full tutorial video series that I am almost done creating and editing, that are going to be added to the Inland Valley Garden Planner. It's going to be I believe it's going to end up being an 11-part video series about landscape design for native and waterwise gardens, and using the Inland Valley Garden Planner and all the resources there to do it, where I will walk you through every step of the screenshots that you just saw. easiest way to stay in the loop for that is sign up for our newsletter. And we will definitely be announcing that on the newsletter once all of those are on the website and ready to be seen. So we are very excited to share all of that work with you sometime soon. And so just to kind of wrap up the design section, so you can see the actual design that I did for my front yard ended up being very similar to that, but combined a few different plants. And because my partner and I like a very grown in, plant dense, almost wild look, instead of an open pathway, we used a native kind of ground cover herbaceous perennial plant called yarrow to have this kind of little meadow that we can then walk through to get through to the different parts of the landscape and do our maintenance. So we did the turf replacement rebate program. This was the house when we moved in. This was it kind of in January when we were starting to think about it. In March, this is us planting. And this is the turf was pretty well dead. These are just some little annual weedy grasses coming back that we knew that we'd be able to deal with. And then here you can see the trench for the French drain was dug, but not in yet. And this, again, because we had a meadowy kind of plant dense area here, this was kind of high plant density, small plants, and a little bit wider with larger shrubs in the back. And so here's that same moment. March, it's in, plant small, smaller plants grow faster, they're cheaper, they're easier to put in. But this is that phase where it's like most people would think, oh my God, those plants are never going to grow. Brought in mulch. This is mulch for our large backyard as well. You wouldn't need this much mulch just to do a front yard like this. And then part of what we did for our turf removal to make sure that the dead lawn was not going to come back is doing what's called cardboard mulching, where we just scavenge cardboard boxes, put them down, water them really well, and then put the wood chip mulch on top. And instead of the plastic weed barrier, which eventually causes lots of problems in the landscape, this will just last 6 months to a year and then break down, decompose, and just kind of become compost in place. So that was our temporary weed barrier. And about 2 months, just starting to grow, a little bit of color. You can see this is one of our trees, a lot of growing to do. French drain goes in, a little bit, starting to work with a little bit of rock to make it more natural. But again, I'm doing this, as I have the time on weekends, so not all right away. But then about 5 months in, I had this moment with the screen door open of, wow, it's mostly green. You don't just see mulch anymore at only 5 months. And you still can't see the landscape design intent yet because all the plants are pretty small and mostly the same size. But then things finally start to grow and the trees are getting larger. The shrubs are getting a little bit larger, getting lots of nice color. We got the front yard certified as a wildlife habitat, which is something you can do from the National Wildlife Federation. This is the first native front yard to go in our neighborhood. So the sign just kind of lets the neighbors know what's going on with this kind of eclectic looking landscape. And if you build it, they will come. Had a hummingbird move in, decide it was its territory. And for a couple of weeks, every single morning, watched it rest on this one dried grass stalk. Really cool seeing what shows up. You'll always lose a couple of plants, so no big deal. Don't beat up on yourself, just reflect. Was it the right plant in the right place? If maybe not, try something else. If so, you can maybe try it again and see if it takes that time. But you can see only at approximately 6 months, it is definitely a garden. There's a lot more growing to do, but plants are well on its way. Starting to get lovely moments of color and contrast. And this is it from a kind of above view at 13 months. So our trees still have a lot of growing to do, but this is a garden. Kind of meeting all of our goals for the wildlife habitat, the beauty, does something different every month of the year. And so, for example, this is it in the spring. And then as the spring plants stop blooming, a whole other series of plants will come in the summer. And so that's just one example. But first, you need to get the lawn out. And so this is going to be a kind of really a crash course, to be honest. I changed up some of the design content because the design part is always the most kind of in-demand part for people who come to this workshop. And this iteration of it took a little longer than I was expecting. So what I'm going to do is quickly go through the turf and irrigation stuff, but I will definitely connect you with the resources to learn more. The most important part about turf removal is realize that you need to do a thorough job. This is your one chance to do your best to ensure that the lawn is not going to try to grow back before your new plants are in the ground. Because if the lawn all starts to try to grow back after your new plants are in the ground, it's a lot harder to try to redig things out or deal with it if the lawn becomes, or if the grass becomes all tangled up in the roots of your new plants. Funny thing about turf is that when you want it to grow beautifully and evenly and green, it seems like it wants to die. But for most of us, with the kind of grasses that we have in our yards, if you decide, I'm ready for it to completely die, it seems like it keeps wanting to come back. Not enough to be beautiful, but enough to cause headaches. So here's the crash course on turf removal. First, you're going to want to identify in general categories what type of turf you have. Basically, whether it's cool season turf or warm season turf. Cool season turf is the most common intentionally planted turf in Southern California, often. Usually it's a tall fescue, like Marathon is a very common tall fescue blend that you might hear of. There's all sorts of different trade names. It's green all year long, even in the coldest parts of the winter, has a relatively wide blade of grass. And if it's really well taken care of, it's an even kind of dark green all throughout the year. If you have all cool season turf grass, congratulations. This is the one grass that really, really doesn't want to live in Southern California. You almost can kill it by turning the irrigation off for a couple of months. But whether or not that's what you planted or started with, most of us have warm season grass mixed in our lawns by now, oftentimes Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass, you can see, is a little bit different. It's less wide individual stems. It's more kind of a stringy series that often grows along the base of the soil. And in the coldest parts of the winter, it goes dormant. It'll turn brown. So basically, if you have mostly this and you have these spots that even if it's been watered, it turns brown in the coldest parts of the winter, those are usually bits of Bermuda grass, because whatever grass you planted, if you have a lawn service, then the gardener's equipment is bringing all the seeds around from every garden that they visit. Or like in my neighborhood, it just blows around because people have it in their front yards and this stuff goes to seed really quickly. It will go dormant. If you stop watering it in the summer for months, it'll go dormant. But if that's all you do, as soon as it gets water again, enough of it will turn green and start growing again to cause problems. So it needs to be removed. In the summer, especially, in just a couple of weeks without mowing, it'll often have these like starburst looking seed heads. So that's an easy way to identify it. And one of the reasons why it's so hard to deal with is because not only can it go dormant and come back, but it will propagate itself by seeds, by stolons, which are basically stems that will grow along the soil surface and reroot, and by their rhizomes or roots that will also reroot. So you never want to try to take up Bermuda grass by using like a rototiller that chops it up and mixes it into the soil, because you'll just be propagating it. There's a few other weeds, if you want to look back through this, that you might identify, but this is one. Most of you won't have it, but if you happen to have it, this is yellow nutsedge. You might not notice it in your lawn, but if you take out the lawn and you see this starting to grow again, just pull it out as soon as you see it. Don't let it go to seed, and pull it out when it's small, because when you pull it out, if it has gotten large enough to create these nuts, those nuts can resprout. But if you just keep pulling it out or use a little bit of that cardboard to smother it out, you'll eventually get on top of it. And so for the main turf removal methods, I'm going to share with you right now. I'm going through this quickly. However, if you are actually going to use any of these methods on our YouTube channel, which I just see Carrie just put into the chat, there is a whole workshop called Removing Your Turf the Right Way, just about turf removal methods. And so whichever method might appeal to you that I'm going to go over really quickly, go to that workshop. Even if you skip ahead to that method, that's where you're really going to have all the tips and tricks about how to make it work for you. But the methods you might consider are going to be, this is kind of my default method number one, called sheet mulching. This is using recycled cardboard, just scavenging it where you can. Oftentimes people will go to like a local bike shop, has big cardboard boxes. The larger the cardboard boxes, the better it's going to work. and the less work it's going to be for you. Some people go to like a local auto body shop that brings in bumpers. Some people use small boxes, but for example, like I worked with someone who worked at Starbucks. She had access to small or medium-sized boxes, but she could get enough to cover her whole front yard in a week at her store. So whatever you can get a hold of. Here we combined it with physically roughly digging out the lawn. You don't necessarily need to do that. But basically what you are doing is using this as a temporary biodegradable weed barrier, like I mentioned. In most cases, if you have the time in larger boxes, you water really well the garden ahead of time, so you're going to be locking in that good moisture. Then you layer your cardboard on with at least 6, if you have Bermuda grass, better 9 inches of overlap. Water that really well again so that the cardboard gets wet and kind of slumps down on the surface. And then cover with your mulch, whether it's wood chips or gravel. And then you can push things back and then cut into the cardboard, make little circles, like an old steak knife or serrated knife of any kind works really well. And then plant your plants, and then the plants can grow in the soil underneath, but you have the benefit of that weed barrier. You also, if you need to, can use paper rolls to do that. If you're just doing a couple of planter beds, you can do that. It's not effective as cardboard, especially for Bermuda grass, but if you just have general weeds, like the lawn's already gone, it works pretty well. The cost can add up surprisingly quickly, but if you use those paper rolls, always get the brown, never the red. The red has a waterproof layer in it, great for construction, but not good for the landscape. But you would get this in the paint section of the local hardware store. I never recommend the black plastic woven weed barriers. This stuff is super common. It's quick and easy to go down. It does prevent weeds from coming up pretty well. But what happens is over time, even though they say on the package that it lets water and air through, which the plants need, over time, all those little pores clog up. And what you end up with is enough clogging up that the air and water doesn't get through well to the plants. If you have something like wood chip mulch on the top, normally as wood chip mulch breaks down, it becomes compost in the soil and you just add more on top over time every few years. But all that stuff becomes a great place for weeds to germinate. Then you're weeding on top of your weed barrier, as well as pulling half broken down chunks of plastic out of your landscape for the next decade. So unfortunately, although it's great in theory, it doesn't work well in person. The second method that we recommend considering is called solarization. This only works in the peak of summer, won't work near the coast. You really need hot heat. And what you do is you water super well your lawn area, and then you get clear plastic at the hardware store, and it's in the paint section. You lay it out tightly and you secure it down using either folding over wood like 2x4. You can use a lot of bricks. Sometimes people use old plant pots with gravel or soil in them, or even like the landscape staples that you would use to hold down drip irrigation. You need to hold it down tight, needs to be in full sun. And for 2 months, you will steam sterilize your soil. Will kill everything in the top number of inches of soil. I actually wouldn't do it that close to that shrub because I have a feeling a number of its roots are going to get damaged. But that's the solarization approach. Works pretty well. None of these methods are 100%. If you have Bermuda grass, it will definitely knock it back significantly. And you're just going to want to, especially the first year, keep an eye open. And then whenever you see it, something starting to grow back, just dig it out right away, and eventually you will beat it back. And that's essentially solarization. If you have like existing trees, both because you don't want to fry the roots, but also because the shade of the tree is probably won't allow enough light to penetrate to really be effective. It might just be enough to damage the roots of the tree, but not kill all the lawn. You might combine it. So here, for example, maybe sheet mulching underneath the tree, and then the solarization farther out in the lawn. And what you want to do is clear plastic, not black plastic. That will not accumulate enough heat. The sun needs to penetrate through. So you get it in the paint section, and 4 mil or 6 mil are the two thicknesses that will work. 4 mil is really perfect. Just the right combination of being thin enough to let enough heat accumulate. sunlight to get through, but thick enough to last the 2 months in the summer that you would need it to be necessary. Method number 3 is just physically digging it up, physical removal. If you have a relatively small yard or a number of young people with good backs, this can be the least expensive method, especially if you're just digging it out with shovels, shaking off as much soil as you can, doing it over a number of weeks and putting it in the green bin. The method you see here over on the left, where they're renting a sod cutter, can get very expensive to dispose of all of that and doesn't really go deep enough to get rid of Bermuda grass roots. You really, if you have Bermuda grass, want to try to dig down at least a shovel's depth. And what I do is I dig down in sections to loosen things up and then reach down with gloves into the soil and pull out all the roots I can and shake things off. So it takes a while, but it can be very effective. If you are hiring a local landscaper or contractor to do the work of removing a medium-sized or small lawn, they'll probably show up with shovels and picks and just physically remove it in a day or two. Can be very effective, especially if you're good with tools to do that. If you have a lot of Bermuda grass in a small yard, you might even combine physically removing it with then like the sheet mulching afterwards. And then finally, if you do decide to use herbicide, just some cautions. The main herbicide that is used on turf removal is glyphosate. It's the active ingredient in Roundup. And the reason why it is so commonly used is because of all the herbicides, it is actually one of the quote safer ones, but that doesn't mean it's safe. There's been a lot of lawsuits recently that have been lost by the manufacturer over whether or not Roundup causes lymphoma. And it's now labeled by the World Health Organization as a likely carcinogen. So I cannot wholeheartedly recommend that you use herbicide. However, if you are going to, here are important safety concerns. Research and wear your proper personal protective equipment, minimum long sleeve, long pants. Don't get this stuff on you. Don't spray when it's breezy or windy. 1, the stuff won't go where you want it to go. 2, you're going to breathe in more of it. 3, if it catches the breeze and lands on your neighbor's roses, it will damage or kill them and they will be very mad at you. Know that Bermuda grass may still come back. Here's the thing. With herbicides, you're not going to be able to spray Bermuda grass, which can't be dormant, needs to be actively growing. You're not going to be able to spray it just once and be done. To fully kill it, you generally need to spray it, wait 2 weeks, water in between. A lot of it will die. Do a second application, up to 4 applications 2 weeks apart. And still, like all of the other methods, some might still come back and you might still need to dig some out. So at that point in time, you're looking at 8 weeks. That's the amount of time that it would take to just smother it with cardboard and wait 8 weeks for it to rot underneath and then plant afterwards, or do it in the summer, wait more than 8 weeks with your sheet mulch and then plant in the fall. The 8 weeks for solarization, the herbicide isn't any quicker. So at that point in time, if you're doing it yourself, I really encourage you to think about the other methods. And then finally, just to mention, if you're going to take on any of these methods yourself, definitely check the Removing Your Lawn the Right Way online workshop on our YouTube page. And then the final thing we're going to briefly talk about, and again, we have a whole other workshop on it. So this is really just to get into what you should be starting to think about, is irrigation. If you have a turf irrigation system, you're probably going to need to make changes to your irrigation system, because those little 4-inch pop-up lawn sprinklers, or sometimes 2-inch pop-up lawn sprinklers, which are maybe fine for your lawn, are going to, in your new beautiful Waterwise landscape with plants of all sorts of different sizes, generally just shoot directly into the plant closest to it. That plant will get way too much water. Everything else in the landscape will stay bone dry. And so there's lots of bad options and a couple of good options. If you are going to continue to have an irrigation system, which for most people is the best way to go, the 2 good options we recommend are retrofitting your spray system to spray above your plants with a high efficiency spray system, which we will show you briefly, or installing a very specific type of drip irrigation called a drip grid, which I will also show you. There's plenty of bad options. Also, I will mention if you have a small yard and you want to be very involved in your garden, not having a permanent irrigation system and just either watering by hand or setting up little sprinklers temporarily connected to a hose can work. But that requires you really wanting to be involved in your garden, both because it takes a long time and also if you're not paying attention, it's easy to actually overwater doing that. So for most people, one of those two options is going to be the best. These, in most cases, are bad options. The little tiny tube, little 1/4-inch tube that then connects to these little button drippers that go to each plant. What we see is whenever we do site visits, we never see one of those that hasn't fallen apart in a number of places, unbeknownst to the homeowner. And additionally, they keep the water concentrated at the base of the plant, which over time, a Waterwise plant wants to grow out roots far and wide and get water actually farther out, closer to the edge of its canopy and a little farther out, and not at the base. They want to search for that water. And so what we want to do is provide a couple of other options. Basically, the goal is throughout the root zone of the plants, we don't want to water often, but when we do water, we want it to be like there was a nice, even, deep soak from like a rain event. And so what you can do is you could retrofit your spray system. So in this case, what I did for my front yard, because it was a space where I didn't want to lay out all of that drip. Drip is great in some places, but if it works for the design to not block the sprinklers in a larger space, I like to retrofit the spray system. And so in this case, most of the locations of the spray were pretty close. I had to move them a little bit in, and there's a way to do that. And you can add 1 or 2 sprinklers if you need to, but then instead of on the little pop-ups, I put them on a solid, taller riser, secured in, and with a high efficiency spray, so that instead of the mist with a lot of like traditional sprinklers where the mist just kind of floats away, these have a more concentrated spray that rotates around. And so in the workshop title that I'll share with you after we talk about drip, we go through step-by-step how to convert your spray irrigation system to something more like this. We also talk about the other approach, which is the drip grid system. So instead of those individual little button emitters that connect to the little tube, what you buy is a 1/2-inch tube where the emitters are actually already embedded on a regular spacing. Most common is 1 foot, sometimes farther apart depending on your soil type, but usually a 1 foot spacing all the way down the tube. So these aren't just little holes. These are engineered emitters so that if it's installed correctly with a pressure reducer and a filter, when it turns on, all of these emit water at the exact same rate. And so essentially what you're doing is you're laying this out kind of in a grid throughout the whole root zone area of the planting. In a small space like this, I would never do spray because it's always going to want to shoot over and onto the sidewalk and into the street. But you can nice and evenly water this pretty simply. In a large landscape, that could add up to a lot of plastic. But if this whole large landscape was going to be planted, this would be the proper way to install drip irrigation system, in my opinion. This is kind of the more commercial style way of doing it, but it's what a drip irrigation system that will last for many years and perform well in a residential situation would normally look like. And essentially on the top, you still see these circles, but those circles continue to spread out. And so if it's installed well, by the time you get 6 inches, a foot down, it's a continuous soak of the root zone, as if it had rained, but just not going through the air. And so if you have pathways or areas like that without plantings, you can skip those. But there's generally ways where you can, if you have a turf irrigation system, cap off most of the sprinklers. You don't have to trench, but you put in adapters, and then you can run the drip irrigation on the surface from there. And so in our retrofitting turf irrigation systems for Waterwise and California Native Gardens online workshop on our YouTube page, we go through how to look at a landscape using my front yard again as an example, look at what you have existing, and think about how would you change that to a high efficiency spray system or different options for well-designed drip systems. And we get technical in terms of all the parts you would need and things like that. And there's even a couple of supplemental YouTube videos where you can see step by step how I would change over either the sprays to the high efficiency style or how I would put together, and you can literally see me step by step putting together the pieces, the drip system. And so definitely check that out if you are actually going to do it. Or for some of you, you might be thinking, well, that's way more work than I want to learn how to do for irrigation. And so maybe it's more appropriate to hire a landscaper for that part. And so with that, what I am going to do just for the very last slide, thank you for sticking with me as we went over a couple of minutes, is just go over the order of things, because this is often the request that we have to kind of wrap this all up and put it in context. You're going to start with thinking about your goals, do your site observations, think about your budget, work through your design. If you're working with contractors, then you're going to talk to multiple contractors, get those quotes, check those references. After you have a design, you've thought about your project schedule, you can apply for your turf replacement rebate, because remember, if you get approved, then you have 180 days to complete that project. Then you're going to kill your turf if you have turf, prepare your site. You can do your soil moving, all of that if you're digging your dry stream bed. Ideally, if you can set up for the perfect project schedule, you want to kill your turf in the summer if you have any of that Bermuda grass, because then it's active and growing. And after you rip it out, you can water a little bit for a few more weeks and just make sure none of it grows back. If you do that in the winter, you don't know for sure if it's just dormant or if it's actually dead. Then you can do any of your main irrigation system work that you're going to do. If you're working with spray irrigation, do all your irrigation work before you're planting. If you're working with drip, some people will lay out that whole drip grid before they plant. Some people like the flexibility to plant and not have to worry about it. But everything up until their like very last connections to running that drip tube is ready to go. Then you plant. If possible, again, late fall to early winter, definitely by the end of March, if at all possible. Then if you have any final irrigation system work to do, running that last of that drip line, you do that right away afterwards. Then any mulching, cleanup, final touches. And then you go into your first year where you're going to be doing your establishment care, usually giving it a good deep watering once a week for that first year, year and a half of establishment, and watching your garden grow in. If you are going to be doing the work yourself, I also highly, highly recommend you check out our installation and establishment of California Native and Waterwise Landscapes workshop on our YouTube page. We teach that occasionally as well, but just taught it recently, so we won't teach it for a while. That will show you kind of with your design, what do you actually do? Thinking about site layout, tips for planting things properly, and then getting things established as well. So definitely check that out. So with that, thank you very much for joining us this evening for this kind of crash course in first things to be thinking about. What I'm going to do now is spend some time answering any questions that came in. Before you leave, if you could please fill out just our quick 4-question closing poll that I launched. That gives us really important information to be able to do some metrics reporting for our workshops, make sure we can continue to offer these free workshops for everybody. And then also, I always love to hear comments in the chat. I'm constantly tweaking this workshop to try to give the best information possible. Sometimes that results in me going over a little bit on the time. Thank you for your patience with that. But if there's something that you found particularly useful from this presentation, and you know you're going to be using it in your project, I'd love to hear that. It's really great to hear what parts people found useful. If there's something that wasn't clear or that you thought could be done better in the workshop, I also love to hear that in the chat, because we're always trying to make it better. And so with that, question from Carrie, we'll go through the questions. From Carrie, she provided a link, these spray conversion kits with inline drip line. And she provided a link for a product that I have used many times. It's made by a Rainbird, and it's something that's a size of a sprinkler, and you can unscrew a sprinkler and screw on to where it is, cap most of the rest of your sprinklers or all the rest of your sprinklers, and then bring your drip from there. There's definitely a place for them. And in the retrofitting turf irrigation systems class, we spend a whole section under drip talking about that specific product. when to use it, or when you might want to do a more traditional style conversion where you're actually doing a little bit more work back at your valve and putting in the conversion kits there. And small landscapes, they're great, but you would get to a certain size of a landscape because there's only so much drip line you can run off of one of those, that you would need to put so many of those in that they might not be the application. But yeah, in the right place, they're great. There's actually a couple of areas where we've used them even in our commercial like our demonstration garden here at the Waterwise Community Center, because they were the right thing for the job. From Helen, can burlap be used as a weed barrier? Good question. Some people, especially if they know people who work at coffee shops, have access to a lot of burlap. I personally have not used it as a weed barrier because I've never had access to lots and lots of burlap. However, I have had people tell me that a couple of layers of burlap has worked well for them as a weed barrier. So I would say I would do some additional research, maybe look online and see if you can get any specific recommendations. So yeah, someone in one of my classes did say that they were successful with it, but I just don't have the opinion, or I don't have the experience to fully be able to recommend it myself. Okay, where can the river rocks or local gravel be found locally? So Helen, if you are local to the Waterwise Community Center, on the web page where you can download, or by the end of tomorrow when I get it posted, you'll be able to download the slides of this workshop. And I'm typing it again in the chat. That's cbwcd.org/presentations. There is also a link to what we call our local landscape suppliers list. And that's just a very small file that has in categories around this area, Western San Bernardino, Eastern LA County, the different suppliers of all sorts of different things, the local nurseries, what types of plants that they carry that are Waterwise or native, but also landscape supply yards. And so there's a few great ones locally, and they sometimes sell slightly different materials. So for example, there's one yard that I would go for one kind of gravel, one yard that I would go to for another kind of gravel. Some of them, for whatever reason, are slightly higher priced in one product, but lower in another. But most of them are in Chino. And so you can make a day of going and checking them out, seeing what they have. And most of them, if you ask, they'll let you take like a little Ziploc baggie full of, something as a sample so you can stay organized. And then wherever you are, that's basically what you want to look up, is like local landscape materials yards. So sometimes you'll see landscape supply is often like irrigation parts and tools, and landscape materials is often gravels, mulches, pavers, just depends on what they have. You can also look at places to buy like rock or rock yards, and most of the ones locally will have the exotic stuff, but they'll also have the local stuff in multiple sizes. Okay, so let's see. There's a few older questions. People are still here. From Zoom user, is there a resource that shows how garden designs look from season to season? That is a great question. Right now, I don't have like a great one-stop resource to offer for that. That's kind of a holy grail of something to put together for me, but it takes a long time of documenting, certain gardens that you visit over a long time. You can always come to our Waterwise Community Center all throughout the year to see what's going on. But I don't have a great single resource. If you are looking for like native gardens, California native gardens, probably the thing that I would recommend you can check out is this year, because of the pandemic, Theodore Payne Foundation's Native Plant Garden Tour was done all online, and they used that to do something interesting and different, where they took a limited number of gardens and they have revisited them throughout the year. So I think they just did the third one. I think they did 3. They did spring, and I think they might have done one in winter, and then they just did one at kind of like late summer, which is kind of the down season for California native gardens. There's still a lot of stuff that is blooming, but there's some stuff that goes a little bit dormant. It's part of the drought adaptation. And so learning which things are going to look great this time of year versus which things kind of quiet down is great. And so that was some great resource that they put together. So I would say it's, I'll type into the chat, it's their name so you can look it up, but Theodore Payne Foundation. And you can check their website, but definitely all of those different versions, those three like presentations, I believe are all available on their YouTube page. So it might be easiest if you're specifically looking for that to go straight to their YouTube page and look for the 2021 Native Plant Garden Tour throughout the seasons. Presentations that are available there. Also worth checking their main website. They have lots of great resources. Okay, and I think that gets us through all of the questions. So thank you very much, everybody. Definitely, if you are new to us, please sign up for the newsletter, check out our other resources, and hopefully we'll have you for other online presentations. And we are setting our workshops up for those of you who are local, setting our schedule for the beginning of the year. And we might go back to doing some in person, keeping some of those all outside in our demonstration gardens so we can stay distanced. So if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll hear about those, and hope to see you before long here in our garden. Have a good evening, everybody.